Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we have a special treat, actually. So we have a returning guest, uh, David, otherwise known as the Vulture. So first of all, hey, David, how are you?
Oh, I'm blessing yourself, Dale. I'm excited to see the show.
Absolutely. Yeah. So fans will know David or the Vulture, he's been on talking about this category of evidence called numerical patterns in the Bible. And he actually, we've had our discussions on that, but at some point we kind of discovered that we need to bring on an expert, someone who really specializes in this area. And hence why we have our new guest of the show, John Elias. Hey there, John. How are you?
Very good. Glad to thank you for bringing me on this show. This is great.
Absolutely. You're welcome. And yeah, just obviously today we're going to be getting into the numerical patterns in the Bible and your research on that front. But just before we get into today's topic, do you want to just take a few minutes to kind of introduce the audience as to who you are? Maybe explain a little bit about how you got into Gematria and that sort of thing. But also explain your faith journey if you're comfortable sharing.
Oh, sure, for real. Yeah. Uh well, I have an almost unbelievable kind of crazy faith journey because I became a Christian really, really young. Almost unbelievably young. And I only discovered this later in life in like my 30s as I was recalling, I was thinking about what was my first memory? And I was raised in a small town in eastern Washington state called Walla Walla, Washington, which was referenced in many Bugs Bunny cartoons. And my very first memory was I was in my backyard on a Sunday afternoon after church, and I remember trying to test God as to whether or not predestination was true. And so I was like, does God know I'm going to do this? Or does he know I'm going to do this? And I was doing this back in the yard. And so that was my very first memory. And I thought about it when I was in my early 30s. And I told my mom about it. And she said, but John, you were only three. And I was like, really? I didn't realize that. And about 4 or 5, when I was like 5 or 6, I, uh, I, after church one day, I came into the kitchen where my mom and dad were speaking, and I told them I wanted to become a Christian. I wanted to give my life to Christ. And they looked at me like I was nuts because they're like, wait, you listened to church? Because and I was like, yeah, no, I understood it. I was like, there's like I want to, and so I was early on, and then I started like evangelizing on the playgrounds at school. And so it's a very strange story because I was like really early on, and I just had this sense that I wanted to, be part of the Christian family and give my life to Christ. And so it's kind of always been there with me.
So I don't mean to interrupt your intro, but I just thought of something very funny because my earliest memory, just to show what a dum dum I was as a kid, but I think I was around 5 or something, and I thought my pastor at that time was God and stuff like that. And I remember asking my parents, like, like why is God so boring when he was giving the sermon? So like yeah, that shows we're opposites. You're the smart one on
I
the
don't know if I'm that smart. Really, I'm pretty much of a moron. But yeah, but that's it's a weird story. I don't tell it very often, but it's like that's how I got started in Christianity, is way back when.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. All right, cool. And what's your kind of background, if you don't mind sharing that as well? Like
Oh, oh no. So I went to college at Wheaton College, and I studied biblical archaeology. I dug in Israel at Ashkelon under Larry Steger of Yale. I mean of Harvard, and which is fun. I digged up a golden or not a golden, but a bronze dagger there in the Babylon destruction era. And so my background is in ancient languages and ancient archaeology. I'm not an expert in that, but I have a basic understanding. And that's what really brought me into Gematria was that unlike a lot of the other people in this field, most of which were like engineers, computer scientists, nuclear engineers, people like that, and also just amateur mathematicians. I had a understanding of the ancient languages, which was really prerequisite and important to understanding the text. is I could look at the text and read it in the original Hebrew and Greek, and most of them couldn't, and nor did they have a real fulsome understanding of the ancient world. And so that helped me to like kind of distinguish me from the rest of the group. And so I could help correct other people. There's a well-known site where I helped create his database in a small way, but just make sure that the texts were correct. So that was my academic background. And then recently, in the last 10 years, I I really got into mathematics, and which is crazy. And this is the funny part, is that I always hated mathematics. I was and I was kind of bad at it. I was like it was like the worst subject ever. I thought it was pointless. And so I had zero interest in mathematics except for geometry, which I thought was really kind of interesting. And so, but when I started discovering this stuff online in the early 2000s about biblical gematria, and I saw these patterns, I'm like, this is bizarre. This is like off the charts bizarre. It's like there were I was seeing patterns, and they weren't mine. I was just looking at other people, guys who were computer scientists and mathematicians who were like putting out this stuff that was like basically scientific. And I was looking at this like, so wait, the Bible is filled with like science codes? That's basically what I thought. And I was like, this is insane. But it also really needed a translator, someone who could translate this stuff to the common masses. And unfortunately, most of the people that were putting it out there, some of my friends and colleagues, were not terribly good at communicating it to the masses. And so I felt it suddenly incumbent on me to like kind of express this to the world. Also, and I was starting to make these really big discoveries in the field because I was digging deeper. But I was like, at the same time, it took me 5 years to figure out whether or not this stuff was legit. So I was doing all this stochastic testing on the data that other people had come up with, and I was trying to figure out, is this legit or am I just seeing phantoms and illusions? And after 5 years, I discovered so much and I tested so much that I was like, it has to be legit. There's just like an encyclopedia of math going on in the Bible. And so that's when I really got into the math, and I dug into math. And so me and my best colleague, Leo Tavares, whose name I'll probably mention a number of times, he's just a brilliant amateur mathematician. And me and him kind of dug into this stuff. And by digging into it, we also had to acquire and learn a lot of mathematics. And neither of us had any interest in mathematics at all. And it turned out we were both rather gifted at it. And so then I told Leo, I was like, Leo, we need what we're discovering here is like not just like Bible math, but actually pure mathematics. And so we need to start publishing this stuff on a scientific database. And so we started doing that about 3 years ago, and we started putting out stuff on the OEIS, the Online Encyclopedia of Integer Sequences by N.J. Sloan, which is the world's mathematical database. It is the end all of mathematics. This is how mathematicians reference. And so we started publishing this stuff. Now we've got like, I don't know, hundreds of published discoveries on there. And the crazy thing about it is that
Peer reviewed, just
oh yeah, it's all peer reviewed. Trust me, it's peer reviewed. It's like got mathematicians that will rip you apart, and they have to go through it, and they will rip you apart if you have like the slightest thing wrong. Oh, tell me about it. It's bad because these are like when you put in something there at the OEIS, these guys are so smart that if you don't dot a single I or something like that, they will rip you to shreds. They're super mathematicians from all around the world. And so N.J. Sloan is also, considered one of the mathematical greats because he created the world's mathematical database. But the funny thing is, and the crazy thing is that me and Leo were neither interested in mathematics before we got into Bible math. And we could actually say in a way that Jesus taught us math. It's insane to say that. I understand when I'm saying that, how insane that sounds, but we really weren't interested in math until we started reading it, seeing it in the Bible, and we started looking up math and learning to love math. And that's really how we got into it and how we were able to become published mathematicians.
Yeah, that doesn't sound crazy at all, actually. I mean, God gives us motivation for everything we do, even if you're just a humble garbage man or whatever. We're all doing it for God. So I totally understand your passion. Maybe not for math specifically, but for me, philosophy, right?
Right,
So
right. Same here. Yeah, philosophy, math, the same thing. Yeah.
sounds good. And one thing that I'll be asking about you later, but I think I heard in your testimony that you did have a systematic methodology for how you approach these things. Um,
Absolutely.
okay, so I want to be asking more about that when we get to the evaluation part then. But
That's really important. Yeah.
yeah, but for right now, obviously the audience and stuff like that, they might be kind of new to this Gematria or numerical patterns in the Bible. So do you want to just kind of outline what is the history or the development been in terms of the study of this numerical patterns and stuff like that? How's that historically?
Sure. Sure. So the modern numerals that we see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, those are what mathematicians call Hindu Arabic numerals. They came from the East, Hindu, and maybe even further east, and then they eventually got over to the Arabic world, which was this great trading center. And then eventually they got to Europe through Fibonacci, and they were a much better way of using it. But prior to that, prior to the Hindu Arabic numerals, they did, the Western world didn't have any numerals, didn't have any symbols for numbers. So what did they do? The the Greeks, go way back, they used the letters of their alphabet as just a substitute for numbers. And it was kind of a weird way they did it. It's not the way you would think of it today. It was like they would use 1 to 10 and then the tens and then the 100s and so like that. And then also the Hebrews did this. And it's unclear at this point, though I've done some research on it, who started it. If it was the Greeks or the Hebrews. Uh, Kyron Berry, the guy who wrote the Greek Kabbalah, is one of the better sources on it, believes it was the Greeks because there's so much more history on it. All the Hebrews I've talked to and the Hebrew scholars I've talked to all say it was the Hebrews, of course. But the historical record is clear that the Greeks were there, have a better historical record, but the Hebrews were probably more prone to not talking about it because it was like a religious secret and it was a part of their religious text. And so it would be likely that they wouldn't be broadcasting that. And plus, the Greeks were like all over the place, and the Hebrews were this small group in the ancient world. Nevertheless, the Hebrews eventually took over the mantle of Gematria, and but they what's important is that they both work in concert in the Bible. And that's where a lot of people have missed it. So like Greek Orthodox, they don't respect the Hebrew text. They think it's all the Septuagint. Hebrews, they don't respect the Septuagint. They think it's all the Hebrew text. And they both have levels of gematria in it. But the trick was, and what we discovered was that it comes in concert. It's Greek and Hebrew, Old Testament, New Testament. And when you get those things together, then the patterns appear in abundance. And that's what we discovered. And that's kind of part of like the evaluation process. The code is that if you don't have them together, you're missing part of it. So the Hebrews couldn't see the full picture and the Greeks couldn't see the whole picture because they were missing half of the picture. And so that's why the modern era of Gematria, where we unify the Greek and the Hebrew, the Old and the New Testaments, that's where the whole picture emerges. And so we use the whole Bible as a unified evidence, our data set.
Awesome. David, just before I move on to the next part and get into, let's have John make his case and give some specific examples. Do you have any questions about the history and the development of this field of study?
No, I don't really have any questions. I'm interested to see if, in case he doesn't know, God has shown me the patterns in the King James Bible. So I'm interested to see if he will have number patterns that will match to what I've seen, just like how he mentioned Fibonacci earlier, and we were talking about Fibonacci before he before he arrived. So that's where I'm interested to see. And also maybe later, if I could request, if I believe I've seen on John's website where he has information about the shroud. Dale does a lot of work with the shroud, so I would be very interested to hear the two of you talk about the shroud.
Yeah, for sure. That's what the listeners and the watchers should be waiting for, because at the end we'll be talking about the shroud. That's the big one. Trust me, we're gonna make some history here today.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, but before we get to that, and I'm extremely excited about that, I've got the Shroud on my list here. But just in general, John, I want to turn it over to you to kind of make your case, right? We've been talking about some of these patterns and stuff. Like, what are some of the best examples of these numerical patterns that you think really shows and proves something significant in terms of Christianity's truth claims?
Sure, sure. So the thing that's unique about biblical gematria is that it has a unique vantage point on the original manuscripts of the Bible, and that's what we do in like what we called pure or technical biblical gematria, is that we look at the original manuscripts. Now, David looks at King James, and I have friends, other colleagues who look at the King James, the 1612 King James, and there are weird and crazy patterns there too. And that's certainly beyond, certainly not out of the question. And I'm all for it, but I also have to keep my focus on things, because if you let your focus go too broad, you kind of lose the trail. And so my speciality, along with Leo's and some of the others, is going into the ancient manuscripts where it all comes from as much as we can. But I'm not opposed to the King James. The King James has got some incredible, and I reference it in my book a couple times, King James patterns, because it's all crazy, and God is certainly capable of doing all of those things. But we also have to keep in mind that we are humans, and we've got to keep a science sense to us so that we can evaluate these things in a fair way. And if we spread ourselves too thin, it starts to look, it doesn't work really. You have to be able to concentrate your focus on things. So I think in a sense, anything is possible, but as humans, we have to keep these things minimalized so that we can like figure out, because we're just not that smart, and we're also trying to convey it to the average human. So the thing is that it's probably best to talk about the modern development of gematria. In the ancient world, it was very common. We have graffiti in Smyrna from Richard Bagnall's book on ancient writing in the Greco-Roman Near East, an archaeological book. We have writing that is actually the very first archaeological discovery of gematria in the world. I think it maybe comes from the 2nd or 3rd century, and it is exactly like something you would be reading off of my website or on other Bible math websites. And it says God, no, it says Lord and faith equals 800. That's a gematria reference, because in Greek, the word kurios, which is Lord, and the Greek word for faith is pistis, they both equal 800. And so some strange person, thousands of years ago, he wrote it on a wall and said, God and faith are equal. And he was making a proclamation, basically a gematria proclamation, that this is proof of God. And this is thousands of years old. So it had a very common currency in the ancient world. And also many famous Christian writers of the past would write about it. Irenaeus is probably the most famous, who wrote, he was a bishop in southern France, I think in the 2nd century, and he wrote against heresies. And he talks about gematria all the time. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, he also killed gematria for the church, because at that time he was writing against gematria, because the Gnostics at that time were using gematria in what you might call a free-form cheating style to defend their beliefs. And Irenaeus was saying, well, this is all nonsense, And the thing is, and this is really important to talk about, and what you're talking about with the evaluation, is that gematria in a free-form style is really easy to manipulate. It's incredibly easy. I've had experiences. In fact, in college, my Professor Hill, of Wheaton College, he asked me to read the Bible code, and I wrote an essay about it. He wanted me to write an essay about it, and I was like, I don't think it's legit. I think it's too complex. It doesn't really lay itself out. At the same time, also a little while later, there was a famous Canadian televangelist who will remain unnamed here, who was talking about the six code, and he had calculated six code, which is like all multiples of six in English, and he calculated that computer was 666. And I was like, oh, that's funny. So I dug into it, and I sent him this email with massive contradictions to his code, where I was like, I could, with that same code, I can make not Adolf Hitler look like Jesus and things like that. So originally I was a very much of a skeptic and against it. But then I started discovering the stuff in the modern Gematria era. And
Just before we go to the modern,
sure.
hopefully you don't mind the interruptions. Let me,
No, sure, sure.
so I just one example you just mentioned is about 666 in the Bible, or some scholars say it's 616 is
Right, right. That's a later, yeah.
do you think that that is an example of Gematria in the actual Bible itself, or is what is that?
Yes, it is. It's something I try to avoid, but I do dedicate an entire appendix to it because it is to an beginner's audience, it's a little bit disconcerting and strange. And the stuff we've discovered in the 666 pattern, which is prevalent throughout the Bible, actually, I call it the shadow of God, um, is part of the pattern. But it also distresses the modern Christian because we all believe 666 to be this horribly satanic number. And I don't believe that numbers can be satanic. That's, but it is a pattern that is important in the Bible. And so, yeah, 666 is definitely, it's the most prominent Gematria pattern in the New Testament, though we have discovered a lot more. And that's what makes the study of this really interesting, is that we've been able to expand this very minor esoteric academic footnote and explore new patterns that no one has seen. And so we have I myself have worked on some of this original uh, original text stuff where we found patterns in the Old Testament and the New that nobody knew were actually Gematria references. And that's because there's a difficulty with the translation, and it's so unknown.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. So interesting. So obviously then it is the proper thing is 666. It's not 616. It's some
That's probably a later scribal error, or uh, you know, back then, they didn't have computers, didn't have the internet, things would get mixed up, and sometimes you would get these rogue scribes, things like that. And so it was probably a scribal error. But if you understand the Math Bible and you understand the numerical symbolism of the New Testament writers, it's not going to be 616. It's going to be 666. It doesn't make any sense, 616. It's like, that's obviously some sort of scribal error. It's 666. Why? Because it's 666. There's like three sixes in a row. That makes sense to anyone now and then. So yeah, but that's a good question.
yeah, awesome. All right, cool. So I'll let you continue. You're about to get into modern examples now. That's what
Yeah,
you
it's right. So basically Irenaeus in his Against Heresies killed Gematria for the church. Prior to that, the church was really big into it. And we have a lot of archaeological examples in the Middle East with the Coptic and Greek Christians, where like one of them is really fascinating because it was an archaeological mystery where they were writing these two characters in Greek, both of which I believe were, or one of which was lost characters that didn't have any currency in the Koine Greek of the time. And the archaeologists, for years and years, they couldn't figure out what these two symbols meant and why the Christians were writing these above their mantelpiece and on tombs and things like that. And it turns out that somebody figured it out, an archaeologist figured it out, and it was Gematria. And what the symbols were not symbols for letters, they were for numbers. And it was 99, because in Greek, 99 means amen. It's a correlation to the amen in Greek. And so they realized like, wow, these guys were still using, uh, they were using Gematria and they were putting everywhere because it's like a kind of a blessing. And so there is a strong currency in the ancient past. But Irenaeus did kind of kill it for the church, especially for the Catholic Church. They moved on. They moved on from Greek. They moved into Latin, which has a really weak gematria. And then it kind of all went away. Um, and, and then we move into like say the 20th century, and it's kind of rediscovered by this crazy character out of Russia who is this super communist atheist in the 40s or 50s. And but he also was absolutely fluent in Greek. And he was reading the New Testament and he knew about gematria and he was looking at the numbers instead of the letters because he was a bit of a math whiz. And he started finding all these really weird patterns in the New Testament. And then he just went off charts. And he eventually moved to America and declared to the world that he would have a debate with anyone in the world. His name was Ivan Panin. And he would debate anyone over the proof of God. Now, that was the very beginning, but he was and at that time there was no peer review, so nobody he could really talk to who could maybe correct him or what have you. So he made some mistakes and he was a little off base. But he also discovered one of the most important things of all, which was the prime factors of Genesis 1:1, which is 37 times 73. And that's basically the fundamental. You can see it right over my shoulder here. That's the fundamental pattern of the Bible, which informs the rest of the Bible. He was the first to really discover that as far as we know. And so that's really where it started. And he went his own way. And then in the 90s, as the internet started getting going, and it was in the 90s, there wasn't that many websites. I mean, today there are like, I don't know, billions, right? Back then there was not so many. And a couple people started putting up these websites about biblical gematria. And there were two that were prominent. One was What a Beginning by Vernon Jenkins, who is the senior lecturer in Glamorgan, Wales, and of mathematics and computer science. And he had this really great scientifically based mathematics site. But it was actually kind of too scientific because it wasn't very friendly to the average man. And the other guy was uh, Richard McGow, the Bible Wheel, which is the 800-pound gorilla of the internet at that time. And he just put out so much stuff. Eventually, the guy fell away from the faith, but which was really crazy, because he had a two-pronged approach. The Bible Wheel represented this subjective literary attack on the Bible, where he thought this Bible wheel connected all these things. I never looked at that. But he also had a lot of math stuff, and he was really good at math. He'd studied nuclear physics and things like that. And so the math stuff, I was like, that's great. But that's really was kind of like the college for the modern biblical mathematical movement, was the Bible Wheel. He eventually closed it down. I resurrected it through the Wayback Machine, and it's on my website if you want to look at it. But so that's where we all kind of got started, because he had a great forum, and all of my colleagues, most of which all came from the Bible Wheel forums, where we were all like studying it. And he had a database where you could study the math of the Bible in its pure language. So that's kind of like where it all started. And then that was like the second phase. The first phase was Ivan Panin. Second phase was Bible Wheel and Vernon Jenkins. And then the third phase was like me and Leo and Rob Slattery from Bible Gematria and some others who created the third phase, where we had taken all what the first and second phase had developed, and we refined it and we codified it. And that was the most important part, because like with William Dembski, how he codified intelligent design, I felt it was like we had to codify this stuff and say, what is legit, what is not legit, because there was a lot of really bad math out there and bad gematria. And mostly we were interested in the math and the improbable patterns that we're seeing. We weren't interested in making up stuff. So we had to respect the text. And that was the most important part, is that you don't mess with the text. You got to look into the text and say, what is the original text, A? You can't change a letter, B. And then look at the pattern. And is that pattern improbable strange, and does it connect to other patterns in the Bible? And so that was basically a short list of what our criteria was to look at it. But if you change the thing, we're not talking about like making up stuff, which a lot of people in Gematria did, the Gnostics did, and what have you. It's like you can't do that. There was a guy, he might even still have his website. He got kicked off of YouTube. It was called the Gematrianator, and he did English Gematria, but he created this website with this massive program that allowed you to look at English in over 30 different codes. Now, when you have 30 codes, you can find anything you want in the data. It's just that simple. You know, you just have to look long and hard enough. And so he created this thing, and of course, he was paranoid. And so he created this massive conspiracy that the media was revealing their hand, and they were part of some Illuminati-esque conspiracy to control the world, and they were revealing that in mathematical gematria, the same gematria that he just invented, by the way. And somehow they were stupid enough to be revealing it, and he was the only guy in the world who could discover it. It was like madness. And so that's kind of why he got kicked off of YouTube, because he was just talking nonsense. So
Okay.
that's one of the bad parts. Yeah.
So I have a few questions then. So the first thing that I noticed, so you mentioned with your method in the third phase that you mentioned earlier manuscripts and stuff like that. So when you say like one of the rules for us is like you can't take out any words or letters, everything's got to be the same. So are you finding these patterns in individual manuscripts, or are you looking for like the original autographs? So you're using what the Greek manuscripts to come up with what scholars say, well, we're 95% confident this is what the originals said. Like,
Right, right. So
what do
that's a
you,
great question. It's a really great question. And it's something that me and my colleagues struggled with for years, because there are so many variations, translations, things like that. And so that's when Leo came up with what he calls the SO Standard Ordinal Theorem. And also we decided which control text we had to use. And that was important, because if you're cherry picking between text and manuscripts, obviously you're starting the manipulation cycle. And what we're trying to avoid is any form of manipulation. We want a single solid text that we can use that isn't cherry picking from one text to the other. Because there's so many different manuscripts of the ancient world, especially with the New Testament, that you can just cherry pick it all day. So what we decided, and this is kind of ironic, especially for like textual critics out there, the Bible and theologists, is that we decided that there was only one text that we could possibly use for the New Testament, which was the Textus Receptus, Erasmus text, and also then specifically Scrivener's 1894 text, the TR 1894, because that was the best and most refined version, and most everyone agrees upon that. And what's ironic about that, or not ironic, but apropos, is that the textual critics of the New Testament, both secular and Christian, they all use the Textus Receptus as a control text. So it made absolute sense from a scientific perspective to use the Textus Receptus as the control text, the main text. Now, most of us in this world are not absolutely fluent in ancient Greek or Hebrew, so we can't go into the Greek or Hebrew and say, well, actually, this says this. Now, the Hebrew is pretty much standardized. It's pretty easy with the Masoretic text. The New Testament just has so many variations, most of which are basically superfluous. But the New Testament has so many variations that we're not capable, because we're world experts on ancient languages like that, that we can go in and say, no, it actually, the movable nu should be in this. There's an article here, and those are the superfluous differences. When it comes to the translations of the New Testament, it really is always almost the same. But we have to have the exact wordage, and that's why we had to have a control text. So the two control texts of technical biblical gematria is the Masoretic Hebrew, with the keteb and the kere variations, which are few and far between, and very much better than the New Testament. And then in the New Testament, we use as Erasmus's Textus Receptus and the Scrivener 1894 because those are the best refined ones. And that way we can control ourselves so we're not cherry picking between dozens and dozens of different manuscripts and manipulating the data. So that's a really good point and really good question.
Okay. All right. So I do have a follow-up. I was planning to ask this later, but it fits in here because of your mention of control, not control samples, but control texts to base, am I getting a hit or am I getting a false positive or something like that?
Right.
I'm kind of curious, have you guys thought about using control texts that are not biblical texts? So, for example, like, do you guys find patterns? For a time in 2017, I was almost convinced by numerical patterns in the Quran, um, and stuff like that. But what I noticed, and again, I wasn't a mathematician like you guys, but I tried to duplicate some of the more simple based patterns in the
Falsification, right.
in the true Furcan, and I could replicate a lot of the more simple patterns and stuff like that. So that indicated to me, well, these patterns can be found in any text, not just a religious text. Like there's no proof that of a divine hand here. And so I'm just kind of wondering, do you guys ever think of using the Quran or even non-religious texts as control
Oh,
samples?
sure, yeah, yeah. I mean, and they did that with the Bible code. In my paper I wrote on it, it was like there was a guy who did it with uh, Moby Dick, who was finding similar patterns in Moby Dick, and that's how he falsify the whole thing. So yes, we do, and we're like you could talk about like the phone book like that, and yes, in any large data set, you're always going to find weird mathematical patterns. And so that's a good criticism for sure. There are large in any large data set, and the Bible is the largest mathematical data set of the ancient world, um, and which is really cool in its own right because it's like Hebrew and Greek are the most strong Gematria languages in the history of the world, and the Bible is just simply enormous. So it's a massive data set. But also the phone book is a massive data set. And if you look long and hard enough in the phone book, you're going to find super weird patterns. That's just how it works, you know. And so that's a good point. But what's interesting or what's compelling about the data set of the Bible is that it starts in Genesis 1:1. And you can't for the life of me, you can't find that in any other book, where the first verse of the Bible informs the entire rest of the Bible. And that's the crazy part, is that the first verse of the Bible is the foundation of all the rest of the math of the Bible. And the first verse is so important that we call it the proto-verse. It is just that important. Everything else flows from the first verse. And so what we're asking is like, does the first sentence in the phone book inform the vast majority of the improbable patterns in the most important places of the phone book after that? And the answer is no, there's no other book like that in the world. That's what's so incredible and crazy about the math of the Bible is that it starts in the very first verse, and the first verse is the most I call it it's the most complicated equation and statement in the history of the world. It's way more complicated than anything we've ever seen in science. I mean, it is not only a mathematical masterpiece, it is mind-blowing beyond anything you can imagine. And we don't have anything, even in the rest of the verses of the Bible, that can compare to it. It's just so far off. And so the patterns we see there, we compare to the rest of the patterns. And that's why it makes the math of the Bible so compelling because no one's ever seen. I mean, we don't even need the rest of the Bible. We just need the first verse. It's the most insane thing. SETI has been looking for patterns from aliens for decades now. They haven't found anything. If they had found the pattern from Genesis 1:1, I'm like, they would be going crazy. It's like, look, we've found an alien intelligence, and it's in the first verse of the Bible. That's where it is.
Now, so it might help the audience, like what are you talking about? So is the pattern that's so remarkable here, is that the 37 times 73 thing? Like what is it what is the pattern in Genesis 1:1 that is so remarkable? Like what are you talking about?
Right. Okay. So like Vernon Jenkins was the one who really first championed this. He's a friend of mine that the professor from Wales, and he dug into it in his website, What a Beginning, and he's got many uh, uh, PDFs on it. So what it is like he dug into the math, and as you can see over my shoulder here, that's Genesis 1:1. 37 times 73 makes this figurative image, figurative geometry, which I'm really good at because I am dyslexic and I'm really good at 3D visualization. And so Genesis 1:1 is not only is it 37 times 73, if you think about those numerals, 3, 7, 7, 3, it's reverse numerals. And they're prime factors, which makes it even more rare. And so he started digging into the math, and everyone's dug into the math. And so it turns out that both 37 and 73 are star numbers. Star numbers were discovered by Martin Gardner, one of the most prolific mathematicians of the 20th century, and then eventually published on N.J. Sloan's OEIS. And I've contributed a number, if not the most, discoveries about the star numbers. So as you can see in the back, you're seeing a star number looks exactly like a Star of David, and
And
it's a collection of dots. Go ahead.
just before you keep going on, so what is 37? Is that the number of words? Like what is the number? What does 37 and 73 represent?
Right. No, so that's a good question. So this goes back to the origin of mathematics with Euclid and his elements and what we call prime factors. And so any number has a scientific data set, which is basically its prime factors. And so like you look at the number 8. What is 8? So we think about 8 as just, the number that follows 7 and is before 9. But scientists and mathematicians think of 8 as by their more scientific identifiable number, which is their prime factors. So what is the prime factors of 8? It's 2 times 2 times 2. Those are the prime factors. That's how nature and math works, is that the real identifier of a number are the prime numbers, the prime factors. And so when you look at Genesis 1:1's value, that is the sum of the Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim va'ad haaretz, in the original Hebrew, it's 2,701. But what are the prime factors? So this is really a scientific analysis of the value that comes from the 3,000-year-old text. And the value of that, the prime factors of that is 37 times 73. That's the first clue. And so we started digging into that because it was a little unusual that it would have such a neat mirrored number. And that's part of the big code that we found later in the Bible, was that this mirroring of numbers was everywhere. And it was all started in Genesis 1:1. And so there was this, and that's also where we came up with, or what I coined the phrase, which was the 3-7 code. And I was the first to do this just because no one had named it. We already all knew about the 3-7 code, but I was like, it's got to have a name. I'm a writer, and I was like, it's got to have a name. Otherwise you don't really know how to refer to it. And so that's what it's, the 3-7 code is the 37 times 73, the prime factors of the first verse. And we see it all over. And we see it in the name of Jesus, we see it in the name of Christ, and thus in the name of Jesus Christ in Greek, Jesus Christos. And so these are like fundamental features of the math of the Bible. And so the pattern you see behind me is a star of stars, which is a type of fractal. And that's another pattern that we see consistently throughout the Bible is fractaling. And that's where like it's really convincing, because why are there fractals in the Bible? There's like fractals were only discovered by Mandelbrot, 5 decades ago. But there's like fractals everywhere in the Bible. And so that's another pattern that evidences. But also it's the way that the name Jesus and Christ fit in with the pattern of the star of stars of Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:1, both 73 and 37 are star numbers, so they make a star of stars, which you're seeing right behind me. And the name Jesus, which is also both multiples of 37, fit like a glove in that pattern. So in the pattern behind me, you see the yellow, you see Jesus. That's the name Jesus in Greek. And in the white, you see Christ. And then in the triangle, the darker stars, that's 333, which pretty obvious. Let's talk about the Trinity there. And there are hundreds it may be thousands of patterns in which the name Jesus and Christ fit into the figured geometry of Genesis 1:1. I've got long web pages on it where it is just we haven't discovered all of them. We probably never will, but it just goes on and on. And so the real question was, and why I got into it in the first place, because nobody was really talking about this, was is the name Jesus in Genesis 1:1? I mean, isn't that the question that all Christians wanted to know, right? It's like, is Jesus in Genesis 1:1? So that's why I got into it. And not only is it in Jesus in Genesis 1:1, it's in there over 25 million times. It's just all over the place. And we could dig more and we could probably find it. I mean, originally I was the first to find the 3 million names of Jesus in there. And then we dug deeper into pure mathematics and we found that there were over 25 million references to the name Jesus in Genesis 1:1, which sounds incredible, but I can show you the math. It's all legit. It's crazy. And so that was why I got into it in the first place. But Genesis 1:1 is the protoverse. It sets the stage for all the rest of the math of the Bible. And in the third phase, me and Leo and some other colleagues decided like at the second stage, Vernon Jenkins and then Dr. Peter Bluer of England, they had discovered the connection between Genesis 1:1 and John 1:1, which is a really huge and massive connection. And the third stage, though, we decided to like dig into it and see, is there anything else in the Bible? Because at that point, it was pretty much just holy names, Genesis 1:1, and John 1:1. So we decided to dig into other things. In the last 10 years, that's what we've done. And yeah, it's everywhere. It's all over the place. My book is shameless plug. My book, I disappeared.
There we
Proof
go.
of God, available on Amazon. It's 500 pages. It's an encyclopedia of biblical mathematics. It's all the proof you'll ever need. And I had to cut it short at 500 pages. There's so much evidence. And so you can see it in the Psalms. There's so much evidence in the Psalms. You can see it in Old Testament holy names, New Testament holy names. And then I guess you might even call it this the fourth phase, is when we decided to go into the realm of pure mathematics and science and see if there were correlating patterns that matched the patterns we saw in the Bible. And boy, did we find them.
Okay, so I'm kind of curious because I think there's different categories of numerical pattern, right? So, for example, in Islam, my friend Dr. Shabir Ali, he has about 5 different categories that he says apply to the Quran, like the miracle of 19, the miracle of 7, whatever.
I'm
There
familiar. Yeah,
are word count numerical patterns. I think that would apply to like those are some examples that you give. There's
sure.
also he has symmetrical patterns, which I think relates to because he has prime number miracles related to prime numbers as well.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know if he has ones in the category of fractals or not, but that would be another category. So, like, I just want to know, like, within the Bible, how many different categories of numerical patterns are there, and what are they? You know, if
It's a good question. It's hard to say because we've tried to keep it limited, of course, because for the skeptics, and that's really important. There's some guys out there that just go overboard and have no control over themselves and just publish whatever they think, you know. And we're trying me and Leo and others, the technical Gematria community, are trying to keep it very strict because the more you spread out, the weaker the evidence becomes. And I'm familiar with the 19 pattern in the Quran, which comes just from a single verse. And some scholars believe that it's a scribal error because it doesn't make a lot of sense in the context of it. And so they have one powerful pattern that they talk about the 19. It's a sacred number in Islam, but we have like mountains of evidence compared to their little kind of molehills. Mountains of evidence, and it's scientific and it's improbable and it's purely mathematical. And so that's the kind of the problem with it, from trying to communicate to it, because it's not like prophetic. It's scientific, it's mathematical. Which to me, as a science guy and a math guy, that's the greatest, But for most people, they're like, boring. I don't like it. It's like, yeah, maybe God's boring, but he also created the universe. And so what we see is patterns uh, that are parallel to science. And that's what really convinced me. It's like, the Bible is full of science. What is going on here? And I was like, that doesn't make sense unless the same guy who created all the physics and math and science of the world was also creating the mathematical subtext of the Bible. And I was like, that's the best proof. But unfortunately, it can be very difficult to communicate, especially without pictures. You got to have pictures because people don't really understand what you're talking about. And so it's difficult to go on a radio show and just talk about this stuff because people are like, what's a hexagram? But you can see here behind me that these are both examples of the patterns. One is Genesis 1:1, and the other one is in the Greek name, Lord Jesus Christ, Kurios Jesus Christos, which makes another star of star patterns that I discovered that is connected to one of the greatest discoveries recently in the history of the math of pi, and which we can get to if you like, where there are like, it's a double pattern in pi, and supposedly pi doesn't have any patterns. But when you understand the Greek gematria of uh, of the name Lord Jesus Christ in Greek, there's a double pattern that goes out to 6,000 decimal places.
So I believe it or not, I have a fan called Jeremy Johnson, and he wanted me to ask you about because he sees patterns related to pi. So I will ask you that, but just before I do, David, I want to bring you in at this opportunity. You've heard John making some of his case and stuff like that. Is there anything you wanted to ask him about or to contribute based on what he's been saying so far?
Yeah, I just wanted to. I would just add a little bit to it. Is that when he had mentioned which with the Bible that God has given me, I use the 1769 King James that the
Oh.
patterns. But some of the things that he was saying match exactly to what I've seen. For example, when he mentioned 99 earlier, the word perfect occurs 99 times in the King James Bible. Uh,
How about that?
yeah. So as far as he earlier had said, God equals faith. You remember that part, John?
Sure.
Okay, so in the King James Bible, the phrase I am occurs 742 times, and faith occurs 247. That's
Oh,
247 backwards. Yeah.
mirroring, yeah.
And then
With that,
Genesis
with
1
that,
1.
also, yeah, sorry, David. Finish your sentence and then I'll ask John something.
The first verse of the Bible, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. That's 10 words. The square root of 10 is 316. I think it's 3.16.
Mhm.
Um, if you see behind him where it says 37 by 73, 3 plus 7 is 10, and 7 plus 3, of course, is 10. If you take the word judge in English, Judge, if you count which letter, like A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, I don't quite know what that is called. John may know.
That's
But
the ordinal.
okay.
It's the
So if you
order of the alphabet, yeah.
so if you take the word judge, Judge, 10, 10 is J, and then U is 21, D is 4, G is 7, 5 is E. You take the square root of that and you get 1010.
There you
So
go.
it just works. It's continually going. He had mentioned earlier, if I'm not mistaken, whenever he was talking about the Greek text, if you go into the Textus Receptus Greek New Testament of 1894, is that Scrivener?
Scrivener,
Scrivener, okay.
the English scholar, yeah.
So if I put what I believe is the word theos in the Greek, if I search for that in the
Right, right.
text, it's going to come up 316 times, like 316.
There you
John was,
go.
yeah. And in the King James 1769 that God showed me, the phrase "the man." Oops, hang on. Make sure, just to get it right, because I want to be as precise as God allows me to be. I believe "the man" occurs 316 times.
Huh,
So it just
that's great.
uh he would also mention 37 earlier, and there's a list of words that occur 37 times in the King James Bible, like Savior, crucified,
Yeah, there you go.
by faith,
Sure.
churches, authority, his word. So as he's saying these things, for anyone who would say, well, this seems like a coincidence, well, that's one massive, massive mathematical coincidence to the point where I can't believe that it's not from God. I can't. I can't believe that it's not from God. That's not possible. Even like with pi, he mentioned God showed me a pattern in pi that if you look in the first 200 million digits of pi in the King James Bible, and when I say that, I'm talking about the 1769. Uh, the word cross occurs 28 times. Well, 200 million is two with 8 zeros behind it. And within there, the phrase the truth occurs 87 times.
Yeah.
One 8 times, like if you do 1 1 1 1 1 1 1, you do that through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. That's 1 through 7 each 8 times, 8, 7. There's a pattern that's how many times they appear each time in those first 200 million digits. And basically, 1 8 times occurs 3 times, 2 8 times occurs 1 time. And if you go 1 through 7, you get 3, 1 1 2, 1 5 3. And there's 31,102 verses in the King James Bible,
Yeah.
and all forms of the word preach occurs 153 times. It's just that's what was shown to me. I'm not a mathematician like like your
Oh, no,
friends,
you're an
but
encyclopedia is what you are. That's
God has
amazing.
shown it to me. It's just what God has shown me, but I I tend to lack the ability to communicate it other than to just show the pattern and I say, look at it. But
Yeah.
some people, they're not impressed because they say, well, other books have patterns, but this is a lot.
It's
This is
very
the
hard to
Bible.
communicate for sure. But
So,
what's
but
funny is
otherwise,
you're talking about
yeah,
316, and that's a prominent number in the code of the Bible because it's the name in there are variations of the name Jesus in Hebrew, but one of the earliest variation was the name Yeshu, which was a kind of a degradation of the name Yahashua. And Yeshu in Hebrew is 316. And and also it connects to what we call the 3-7 code, where 316 is uh, 7 cubed minus 3 cubed. So there's a 7 and a 3 again. So 316 is a prominent number. And then furthermore, what's so funny is that your name is David. We're looking at that. And David, of course, is from the Hebrew, David. And it's one of the most basic gematrias in all of Hebrew. And most people don't know this because they don't know much about gematria, but the entire New Testament starts off with a reference to gematria, but it's subtle and it's hard to say, but it's all connected to the name David in Hebrew. And so what happened, look at Matthew, the first couple 17 verses, I believe, in Matthew, and it's a genealogical list of the of the ancestors of Christ. And at the end of that genealogical list, Matthew summarizes it all by saying, and there were 14 generations to Babylon, there were 14 generations to this, and there were 14 generations to Joseph. And then you're just kind of left with like, well, okay, great. There's 3 14s. What does that mean? Well, this is one of the primary evidences that the Gospels were actually originally written in Hebrew and written to a Hebrew audience that could read and understand Hebrew. Because in Hebrew, David is 14, and it's such a simple name in Hebrew that any Hebrew student who went to shul or Hebrew school would know the sum of David is 14. It's one of the most prominent names in the Old Testament, and it's so easy to add up. It's 6 plus 4 plus, it's like so simple, is that you're like, it's everyone know that David was that. He was making a geometrical reference to the name David, that it was these generations were proved out by gematria and math and to be empowered by God. And so your name, David, is part of the proof right there.
I can believe it because even when you were talking, if you said 14 3 times, right?
Yeah.
14, 14, and 14. The word believe occurs 143 times in the King James, and 14 times 3 is 42, which The word forgiven occurs 42 times in the King James. And interestingly enough, if I'm not mistaken, my name David in the English in the King James first appears in Ruth 4:17. My birthday is July 14th, 714. So it's
Okay.
417, 714. But in the beginning, God is 4 words, 17 letters. And
Mhm.
then in the beginning is 3 words, 14 letters. In the beginning, 314.
Yeah.
So it
It's
just goes on
endless.
and on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's endless. Yeah. You've discovered it. You're into it. Yeah, it's endless.
I didn't discover it. God showed me.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Say, yeah.
I'm just curious, just offhand though, like, did any of the patterns David suggested, were they all significant, or like were there any offhand where you're like, it's kind of, I think you had a word for it, freehand or something, free.
Well, there are various levels of proof, and we judge them through like improbability theory or probability theory, and we're like, so some of them like free form is what you would call a lesser form, like free association between words. It's very suggestive, and what led us all into it. And so you're like comparing words like faith and Lord, which are equal. That's suggestive, but not it doesn't rise to the level of scientific evidence at that point. But it leads you in. It opens the door to it. What we really look for is more highly improbable and super complex patterns that are deep into the in pure mathematics and science. That's where the real stuff is. And so the lesser forms of gematria, and I don't mean to degrade it, David, because that's where I got started for sure. And I think there's a lot of evidence there. But you have to go to the next level to find the stuff that is going to convince the scientists and the skeptics. And so there is a free association between certain words, holy names, and things like that. That is the opening, is the basis or the level, first level in. But to get to the point where you're convinced, you got to climb up a few stairs before and when you start getting into patterns that you see in the periodic table, in in DNA, in physics, in music, things like that. When you see those patterns and they correlate exactly with biblical patterns, that's when you're getting into the really good stuff, the stuff that is incredible, or like the 6,406 decimal places of pi, the double pattern according to the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now you're getting into stuff that is so insane that skeptics, they can doubt it if they want, but we're just gonna laugh at them because it's ridiculous. And so what David is talking about is kind of like the first couple levels into the subject. And that's how you get introduced to it, and how you then you can start to climb the ladder up. But that ladder requires a lot of scientific and mathematical understanding to get to those higher levels. And it also requires more more difficult to translate explanations because the science gets tough. So
So when you get up to these higher levels, is that what you were calling these codes? Because you mentioned a few times, like in order to get these patterns, like one guy had 30 different codes, and you said that was way too much, or if I heard properly, or something.
right, yeah.
What exactly do you mean by these codes, and how do you arrive at that? Like, is that what you're talking about, the higher levels, and then that becomes a
Well,
code? Yeah.
right. It goes back to the control text because in any given data sample, you have to have a control. And most everybody who's into this in an amateur way is just kind of free forming it and going crazy because they're exploring and having fun. But that's not really science. In science, you have to have a control. And so that's why we have the control text of the Masoretic Hebrew and the Textus Receptus. That way we can't cheat. And the other control, which came up with my friend and colleague Leo Tavares of Mathematical Monotheism, he who's a brilliant guy. He came up with what we call the SO theorem, which stands for standard ordinal, which means that there are only two numerical patterns worth studying and that we can use. And I when he came out with it, I was like, oh, I had that same idea. Why didn't I come up with it? And but it's like it was brilliant because it really controlled you from like searching all these different patterns where you're cherry picking. And also the th most like the two most important parts is number one, ordinal and standard are the only numerical texts that are found in the Bible, in the original text of the Bible. Standard is there because it's historical Gematria. But there's also the ordinal, which is there in a kind of subtle way in the acrostic texts of the Psalms, like Psalm 118, where the first letter of every verse is a kind of poem where it's like A, B, 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 like A is for apple, B is for boy. That's an acrostic text. That translated into math is the ordinal, the order of the alphabet. So we were able to discern that there are only two prominent things. And what's more important is that what we discovered once we decided that there could only be two, because they're the only two, is that we found out that they fit together and correlated like no other patterns ever did, that you can't find with any other codes, is that they were meant to go together, and that we've got pattern after pattern that are all connected in that way.
Okay. Okay. So codes, there's two that you guys find at this level of scientific prominence kind of thing.
And his that are historically viable, yeah, that are there originally in the text.
Okay. And so the codes are kind of like the rules by which you discover, oh, there's a pattern. It fits this pattern here. It fits this code here kind of thing, right? So I'm okay, so there are various instances that fit these two different interlocking codes. Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. Well, I was going to ask you with David's example there. I was wondering because I noticed he said there was one that was mirrored, right? Just like the
Right.
3773. So I was wondering if that's a valid code, would that mean we would expect to find these star numbers and the fractals just like in Genesis 1:1? Like, is it applied equally? Yeah, like
Yeah, well, what we discovered, Leo is one of the great champions of this, was that the the a lot of the mathematical patterns were mirrored numbers, the mirrored primes, and he discovered stuff that is like off the charts, like crazy prime patterns that use prime indexing, like really deep mathematics stuff. And he discovered that these patterns, because he got really fascinated by an early discovery, was that the sum of Genesis 1:1 was 2,701. But if you reversed it and you did 1,072, which is the numerical reverse of 2,071, and you added those together, guess what the sum is? 3,773. Same pattern that you see in the prime factors. That's the 3-7 code. So he started searching for that pattern all over the place, and he found it all over the place. And in deep, deep math, deep prime indexing, and things like that. And so that's where kind of the genesis of the 3-7 code came from, was that we were looking at this stuff and are like, there are so many threes and sevens, and this a bit later for you watchers out there will connect to the Shroud of Turin, is that there's like threes and sevens everywhere. And so then I started thinking about the theology, and this is where it really gets interesting, because mathematicians are not as interested in this topic as theologians are. And theologians are more adept at understanding what we're talking about. I was talking to a theologian about a year ago about some of these concepts, and he was like, oh, well, that makes total sense. And he was bringing up things I'd never heard of. Theologians have, so what we really need is theologians to get involved in this and help us interpret it, because we're just mostly math and science guys. We have a limited understanding of theology, but we're trying to make some connections. But the theologians could come in and really run the gamut. We can tell them the math, they can tell us the theology. And so what I was thinking about with the theology, the 3-7 code is like, so if there's all these threes and sevens, and this is a numeral code, not a number code. Numerals are the cardinal numbers, 1 through 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Those are cardinal numbers. And those are also numerals. They represent larger numbers. So it's not a code based on 37 and 73. It's a numeral code based on 3 and 7, which is a lot more theologically significant, because obviously 3 is New Testament significant. It represents the Trinity, which was the revelation of the New Testament, that there was a Trinity. And then you go in the Old Testament, what do you got? It's got a ridiculous number of references to the number 7. It's like the Hebrews holy number. It's there everywhere. And it's in there in the Genesis passage. So you got this kind of representation of the Old and New Testament. You have 3 for the New Testament, 7 for the Old Testament, and it kind of digs into there like that. So it has these deep theological roots. And I was like, well, does the text itself have any connection um, to the 3-7 code? And I was like, I started digging into it. And I was like, well, and David mentioned this earlier, 10 commandments, right? Everyone knows about the 10 commandments, 3 plus 7, right? 4 gospels of the New Testament, 7 minus 3. The name Jesus in Hebrew, 58. That's 3 squared plus 7 squared. 40, one of the most prominent numbers in the Old Testament, the 40 days and nights, and the 40 days after Christ's resurrection and when his ascension. It's all over the Bible. That's 7 squared minus 3 squared. And you start looking at this stuff, it's like, it's all these like weird mathematical patterns that are purely math based, that are based on the numerals 3 and 7. And so, yeah, and so to answer David's question or a query is that they're like, mirroring is a huge pattern that we see all the time and that we look for. And it was something that was found in the pure math and not in the text itself that we didn't know. But it also correlates to that pattern, the original pattern, 37 times 73, which is why my website is called 37 times 73, because that's the most prominent pattern and it shows a mirroring of numbers. And it tells you a little bit about the philosophy behind the numbers and the philosophy behind what's going on. That this goes back to Heraclitus and the Logos and ancient Greek thinking that and a modern day thinking, because the most prominent pattern in all of science, most people know this, is symmetry. And it's also the most prominent pattern in mathematics is symmetry. And what we see in the mathematics of the Bible is symmetry, a symmetry between a numerical symbolism of symmetry. And so, yeah, mirroring is a big deal.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, I do have one last what question before I get into the Bill Dembski evaluation part. And
Sure.
so this is for my fan Jeremy there, and he was asking you about like what are hey, what are some of the patterns related to pi? So for example, this is what he says. This is what he gives. This might be on kind of the free association level, but he says that the Hebrew Gematria for Jesus the Messiah is 756 in the Hebrew,
Mhm.
and the Greek Gematria for Jesus the Messiah is 2365. And then he does 2365 divided by 756 equals 3.14 equals pi, in other words. So, yeah, like what I'm kind of curious, what do you make of that specific example? And if that's just free association, are there better examples related to pi that you know of?
Yeah, there certainly are. I'm not familiar with his numbers, which is a kind way of saying that I don't know if they're historically accurate. Like he's close. The Hebrew Yehoshua HaMashiach in standard Hebrew is 754. And then the Greek, Jesus Christos, is 2368 in the standard Greek. So it sounds like he's a little off. I'm not sure where he's getting his numbers. He might be using later translations. I'm not sure. But, the Hebrew for Jesus is kind of a difficult historical puzzle to put together, that not most people don't get. Most people don't think most people think his name is Aramaic Yeshua, which it's not. So it's difficult and you have to really dig into the academia. But are there better patterns? Oh, yeah, there are. And maybe if you allow me to share, I can do a little tour of
I've
what's going on. So let me see here.
I've put it. Yeah, you should be able to share.
Okay, so are we seeing that there? Are we seeing my
Uh,
website?
it's yeah, the logos report. Yeah.
Okay, so there we are. So this is my website, which is filled with wonderful animations, things like that. This is a really long animation about pi itself. This is the first 150. As you can see here in this animation, this GIF, this shows you all the different patterns that correlate to patterns of the Bible, like the Lord's Prayer here does a half star. Um, and that's the 37th star, which is found in pi. 37th hexagon found in pi. 37th centered nonagon found in pi. And these are all the decimals of pi. That's John 1:1, the basis, and then Genesis 1:1 completes the triangle, which is Peter Bluer's triangle. 7-3, that's the 37th triangle number. And you see 703, 703, 703 comes again and again. So these are some of the patterns that we see that I put together on my website, just so that you could see that pi is festooned
And
with, go
what
ahead.
is what is this pattern? So in pi it has these decimal places, and you're taking a subset of the decimals that mathematically equals this shape, whatever shape it is.
This is what we call digital summation in mathematics. So we just sum the numbers as the decimal numbers. And then we come to a certain place and we find that these patterns make these shapes, and they correlate very well with the patterns that we see in the Bible. This is not in the Bible, this is in pi. So we're just looking at pi itself, and we're seeing that these correlate very well with the patterns that we see in the Bible. And so it's some of the best proof that we have. But if you really want to get into the very best proof, then we can get to, I'm going to scroll down here for a second. Here's my, this is my pi web page. And I'm a big fan of pi, clearly. It's on the cover of my book. That's because it's the, you can see it in the middle of that hexagram there. Because this is probably some of the best evidence we've ever seen. And so what I did was I was like, okay, so the name Lord Jesus Christ, Jesus Christos, Kurios Jesus Christos in Greek comes up to 3168 in standard Greek Gematria. So I was like, so what does the first 3,168 decimals digitally sum to in pi? And I looked at it, and it summed to 14,560. I was like, oh, so what does that mean? So what I did then next was I went to the world's mathematical database, and I looked up that number, and I'm like, is that a significant number? Does it make any patterns? And it turned out to be a first octagonal number, a number that I've made a number of important mathematical discoveries in, including this, which is a pyramid box. I was the first to discover it. It's a correlation. It's a connection between all the cube frames going out. So the octagonal numbers are kind of important. They're important polygonal numbers, and it's a series of cube frames. I call it a pyramid box because you can fit a pyramid on any side of it. So it fits pyramids on it. So I call it a pyramid box. But if you look at the first 3,168 decimal digits of pi, it adds up to this pyramid box, which is kind of crazy because it's such a beautiful and 3D geometry, and something we see a lot.
Okay.
And
So just
go
to
ahead.
clarify what you're doing here. So okay, so you're first starting out with the Bible, and you're taking like a phrase from John 1:1, like Lord Jesus Christ, and that gives you a number of 3168 somehow. Then you're saying, okay, well, let's take that number 3168 and add up all the decimals in pi, and then it's giving us like this unique octagon. I forget, it's a special word, but the first octa, what was it?
Octagonal number. Yeah.
Octagonal number.
A number it's basically Greek for like eight-shaped.
Okay. Okay, so did I get the process right? Is that what you're doing here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we're digitally summing the decimal digits. And that's a standard tactic, a standard technique that we use because it's also the most simple. And it's a mathematical thing. So it's so simple that we're like, okay, we're not cheating it. We're not using different ways. We're just doing a basic summation of the digits. It's fundamental math. So this is a pyramid box, and what the first 3,168 digits of pi creates is this pattern. Now, I've made some really fundamental discoveries in the octagonal numbers that I've published on the OAS, and you can check them there. If you go on the OAIS and you just put in the search bar my name, John Elias, you can see all my discoveries there. And one of them was this, which was published immediately by N.J. Sloan because it was like kind of important geometrically. So it makes this box, but it doesn't just make that. It also, what I discovered was that octagonal numbers, which you're looking at here as an octagonal number, is actually the top half of a star number. And I was the first to discover that, and I published that on the OAS as well, is that it makes the top half. And then in mathematics, there's like there's polygonal numbers, and they come in two different categories. The first and second octagonal numbers, which you call generalized polygonals. And so what you're looking at is this is the first octagonal number. And then the second, which is using negative integers instead of positive integers in the equation. In the second, it creates the second half. And so in this picture here, the white is the top half that was I discovered in 3168. And then the second pattern found in pi, which is found in 3368, I believe, is the blue part. And it completes a star. And so when I discovered this, I was like, holy cow, there's a star in the first 6,000 decimal places of pi. How is that possible? But I didn't understand at that point what the number 3368 meant. I was like, what does that mean? I didn't have any connection. And I've got this massive 500-page database, and I was looking through it all. I was like, there's no connection. It's like, it doesn't have any a Gematria connection. Like the first one is abundantly clear. 3168, everyone knows, is Kurios Jesus Christos, Lord Jesus Christ. And I was like, and finally I just sat back one night and I was like, I guess I'm never figured out. And then this is how oftentimes things occur to you, is when you relax, the idea bounces into your head. And I was like, 3368, 3368. It's like, oh, wait. I bet you that's the definitive version of the Lord Jesus Christ. Brought out my calculator, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, in Greek, the definitive version of the Lord Jesus Christ is ho, which is the definitive nominative Greek for particle or article for the. So it's ho kurios Jesus Christos, which means the Lord Jesus Christ. And the bottom part represents the latter half, the 3368 decimals of I might be getting that number wrong, but but basically it's around that number, is that that's represents, so the top part represents Lord Jesus Christ in Greek, and the bottom part represents the Lord Jesus Christ in Greek, and it creates a double pattern in pi that completes a Star of David, one of the primary patterns that we find in Scripture. And it's like, wow, because they're always saying that there's never been a pattern in pi. You know, that there is no such thing as a pattern in pi. And like, I'm sorry, but there is, and it covers 6,000 decimals. I'll try to return to
have you extrapolated this in some way? Like, does this pattern, or I guess code, for lack of a better word, apply to other things? Like, I don't know, another phrase about the Holy Spirit versus Holy Spirit. Does that translate from the digital summation of the digits in pi, whatever those are? Do we get the
Oh, it's a good question.
Yeah.
It's a good question. It's like, yeah, I've done some work on the Holy Spirit, which is 1080, which is funny because that's like the diameter of a television screen in Greek. But pi is so large that there could be any kind of pattern. So the way to think about pi is that you should be is that pi is not all equal. Pi is an estimation of the radius of the circumference of a circle. And so the first digits of pi are the very most important. So you imagine, like, you get 3, and then you get your decimal point 1. 1 is a towering number. 4 is a little lesser. 1 after that is a little lesser, and it keeps going down and down. So when you're getting out to the 6,000 place, those numbers are minuscule. Basically, it only takes 10 places of pi to accurately plot out the circumference of the Earth from outer space. And so, I mean, and it's like maybe 15 to do that for the entire universe. And so, in other words, pi is ridiculous, and you don't really need all that. So, but you also have to think about pi in a weighted way, where the first decimals are far more important than the latter decimals. And so when people are pulling, say, extracting decimals in pi that are like 2 million to 2 billion way out there and saying finding patterns there, it's like that's not important. It needs to be concurrent. It needs to start from the beginning so that you're being fair, because those numerals in the beginning are way more important than the ones that are out in the billions.
Hey, okay,
So
so
I haven't really discovered any that beyond that. I mean, we basically focused on the holy names because that's where all the great evidence was.
gotcha. Okay, okay, but just as a prediction, like, would you, if there are these, another set of these octagonal numbers or something related to something else, would we expect it? Would you predict that we would find other patterns in, say, the first 20,000 digits of pi or something like that? If there is another example, would it repeat, or is just truly just
Well,
one?
that's a great question. So me and Rob Slattery, the Australian mathematician from BibleGematria.com, good friend of mine, we set up a database that listed like basically the first 50,000 decimals places of pi, the golden ratio, and E, the three most important uh, uh, irrational numbers from in mathematics. And we would look at those. And so we have looked at basically the first 50,000, but obviously pi is infinite. And so I haven't found, I mean, I found patterns that correlate and connect that are like echoes, fractaling echoes of the Bible. But when you're dealing with an infinite pattern like that, you just don't know when it's going to correlate, and we only have like 50,000 at this point that we can know, but we have seen some very distinct patterns in the early on decimals, which is where the most important evidence would lie. So but yeah, you run a supercomputer, on the first couple billion, you're going to find things, but that's where the math gets a little more difficult to decide whether it's viable or not, because you're looking at such a massive data set. So once again, the important part is to keep it limited, because the larger the data set, the easier it is to manipulate.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Cool. So, David, did you unmute yourself to say something or?
Well, I don't remember precisely, but I do understand what he's saying, though, in the sense of it was kind of like earlier whenever we were talking about with the digits of pi, where people will tell you, well, pi supposedly goes on forever, so they will claim so anything you want to find in pi is there, all of our phone numbers and addresses, but you're looking for a pattern within a data set, like for the first 11 digits of pi. If there's a pattern there, okay, now we've got something like the Fibonacci sequence. The first part of the Fibonacci sequence, it goes 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55. If you add those up, you get 143, the word believe in the King James Bible, 143. But the interesting thing after that is that after that number in Fibonacci, you would get 89, which is, if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, there are 10 digits and then 89. So at the 11th digit of pi, Fibonacci is 89. There's 1189 chapters in the King James Bible.
Correct. Yeah.
Uh, in pi, if you count the decimal, you get three. If you count the three, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 9, 2, 6, 5, 3, 5. That's 11 numbers. 11 and then 89. You get another pattern right there. So it's coherent. It's not just we're not just making up things to say, oh, I saw a number 7 the other day and there's 7 letters here, and you're not creating things. We're not, people will say, well, you can make patterns in anything, but I'm not making patterns. I'm being allowed to see patterns.
There you
Uh,
go. Right.
the let me see here. I wanted to see if you look in the King James Bible. We just talked about how in pi and the Fibonacci there's 89. Well, the Holy Ghost occurs 89 times in the King James
Well,
Bible. So what's happening here? You know, I
right.
I I do not have anywhere near the mathematical ability that Mr. John here has got. If I'm seeing the beginning patterns,
Oh,
then
come
I am
on.
blown away
Sure you
by
do.
God. No, I'm blown away by God. If this is, and that's, it's beautiful, in the sense that if this is so much deeper And I believe that it is. I mean, how could it not be?
Right.
I'm wondering what we're missing. There's so much
Yeah.
data here that,
Yeah.
I would say that I must be seeing the very tip of the iceberg, and then Mr. John is
Absolutely.
seeing the first couple of inches. What's the next couple of miles go? So it's truly mind blowing, and it's not like the idea of not believing it. I couldn't force myself not to believe if I wanted to.
There you go. Well, and I'll do you one better. I'll do you one better, David, is that you're talking about 89, 11th Fibonacci, is that 89 is a prominent feature of the code because it's one of the first archaeological examples of Gematria. And it's a kind of a bit of surprise. I talked about it earlier in Richard Bognell's archaeological piece about Greco-Roman graffiti in the ancient world. And that's that's one of the earliest and most prominent citations of Gematria, archaeologically speaking. And then we talked about how like Lord equals faith in standard Gematria. But at that point, they didn't really have a fulsome understanding of the ordinal. And this is the first proof in history of Leo Tavares's SO theorem, the standard ordinal theorem, because against odds and long, long odds, not only is faith and Lord in Greek equal, it's also equal in the ordinal when it shouldn't be. And so those are really long odds. They might be something like 1 in 10,000. And Lord in ordinal Greek, kurios, is 89. And so it connects to your 89 very well.
I am not by any stretch of the means a mathematician at all. I wasn't even a math person ever.
Me
Um,
neither.
but a lot of times I see with square roots, such as, for example, the word holy in the King James Bible occurs 611 times.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
of course, 6 times 11 is 66, 66 books. But
Right.
if you take the square root of 611, you're going to get 24.7. Remember, faith occurs 247 times. Faith, 24/7. So the square root of holy, 611, is faith. The square root of holy is faith. There's a there's a mathematics there, but there's also the concept that the square root of holy is faith. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So I'll let John respond, but after that, I do want to transition to the evaluation portion. Or
Sure,
the
sure.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not into uh square roots that much because I don't care for decimal remainders. I want everything to be whole integers, things like that. Make it neat, clean. I'm not saying it's not available, it's not there, but I have like made serious additions to the mathematical record in the square roots of 2, 5, and 17. 5 and 17 are important because they're the third and seventh prime, things like that. And we found patterns there. But yeah, square roots work. I just prefer to go with whole numbers because I know some skeptics gonna like question if there's like a decimal remainder. Like, well, it's not exactly that, so I just prefer to go that way. And there's so much that you could do there, but me and my colleagues try to keep it as clean as possible because we know we are going to be assaulted by atheist skeptics. And if we don't have all our ducks in a row, they're going to destroy you. And so we try to keep it as clean as possible. But I'm not saying those things aren't possible. There's so much that's possible. But as an introduction to the discipline, we have to keep it as strict as possible so that it's clean for the rest of the world to see.
awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. All right. So I do want to transition to methodology and if how do we evaluate these claims, especially for laymen like me and David, who are not mathematicians and stuff like that. But the first thing I just want to get from you is you have developed you have a methodology that you're using that is recognized by the scholars and apparently peer-reviewed literature. I don't know if you've published papers and stuff like that, or is it just on this you call it the O website or something like that, the
Oh
official
yeah, yes,
site.
yeah.
Um,
Um, go ahead.
yeah. Oh, so yeah, I was just wondering, have you like published in papers as well? But I just want to give you an opportunity to explain like what is the systematic method you're using to say, yes, this is a successful hit and it's
Right, right.
statistically
Okay.
significant versus
Right.
random chance.
So I haven't wrote a scientific paper yet. I do have a scientific journal from Canada that is begging me to write a paper on this and on the methodology. And then I also have desperately have to write one on uh, the patterns in DNA and the 64 codons that is based off of two other um, uh, published peer-reviewed papers, Sherbak's and then Rakoczewicz, which both found, and this is the amazing part, it's probably too in-depth to get into it in this discussion, but one of my colleagues, Parta Cooper, who is a medical researcher in England, he read a lot of the scientific literature and he discovered these two papers, one by Vladimir Sherbak, who wrote about the pattern of PQ037, which was basically the thesis of this paper, was that DNA, the universal code of all organisms and life on the planet, was based on the prime number 37. That fit the lock like you could not believe. And we're like, whoa. And it's like, it's just filled with Bible math. And the funny thing is this guy he's an atheist. And he writes this thing, but he thinks that the whole DNA thing is this arithmetic, this biological abacus. That's way how nature corrects its mistakes is by using math. And then Rakoczewicz came back and he found the exact same patterns in a totally different way, all based on 37. And so I've done work on it and I need to publish that paper too, because there's so much more to that they didn't even understand because even though one of them is a mathematician, they weren't into the kind of math that I was. And I was able to see the exact same patterns they were seeing and extract a whole lot more that was just, a lot more interesting. So yeah, I've got to write those papers. But as of yet, no, I haven't written a scientific paper, largely because I got cancer right after I finished writing this book. On the last day of writing my book, my Magnus Opum, this 500-page thing, and I don't know why I'm laughing. It's not funny. But the
Well,
last
you
day,
gotta laugh. You gotta
you
laugh.
gotta
Like,
laugh or you're gonna cry,
right.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so on the last day of writing it, I was like, whew, finished that. I wrote the last caption of the last 300 illustrations that are in the book. And I was like, well, that's over. And then that night I got rushed to the hospital. I thought I was having a heart attack. It turned out I wasn't having a heart attack. It was just like some sort of gastric thing. But they gave me an x-ray and they said, guess what? You have stage 4 lung cancer and you're probably going to die, like in a couple months, which turned out to be not wrong. I didn't have stage 4 cancer, lung cancer. I had stage 4 cancer of the thymus, but I was pretty much dead anyway. And the weird thing was that it is the timing. It's like I just finished the book, and then God puts that on my platter. But God moves in mysterious ways. So I had this long, hard fight, chemotherapy, massive surgery. I was in the hospital for 10 days. They cut me from here to here. I almost cut me in half, and then the radiation. And right now, apparently, I'm in remission, but you never know. It's probably going to come back. But so that's why I wasn't able to follow up on a lot of things. It was because I got hit with cancer, and why I wasn't able to write these papers because cancer is a bit of a bitch. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, well, the good news is you do have like partners and stuff, right? Like you have one
right,
partner. I don't know if, yeah, like maybe he could write for that Canadian journal or something like that sometime. Like,
sure, yeah. So
or
yeah, that would be a good idea is to write in that. And I know the guy, and he's like, you need to put this out there in the plug. And then I should also put a lot of things on maybe academia.com or something like that. I could just like put things out there in the public sphere. But and basically, the problem with Bible math is not the math; it's the publicity. Is like conveying it. There's been a lot of guys who have tried to come out on YouTube, but they're just too robotic. They're not interesting. It's not interesting the audience. You need to have a face, you need to have a personality. And that really is, we lack communication skills because we're a bunch of nerds and geeks who like math. And nerds and geeks about math just go on and on about math all the time. It's like that's not really something that people on YouTube want to watch. You want to watch something that's filled with interesting graphics and things like that people are interested in. You have to talk to the people, and we're just a bunch of math nerds.
yeah, 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 that makes sense, kind of thing. So, okay, all right. Well, outside of peer review, and look, I totally understand as a pro shroudy, sometimes we have issues getting into peer review and stuff
Sure.
like that that comes up. So, but outside of that, did you mention like so what is your methodology? Like what systematic approach are you applying to these patterns to go, yes, this is good, this is
Right, right.
no good.
Right. So like, yeah, the specified complexity argument with Dembski, and that sort of thing is that, well, first of all, I've already outlined a lot of it, is that you have to have a control text. You can't use free association. Free association is fun, and it's an intro into the subject, but you really can't use that as scientific evidence because that's where the manipulation begins. And creating wholly new calculation abilities, or that's also a form of manipulation. So basically you're trying to assiduously avoid any type of manipulation, which means you have to respect the text as it is. Kind of like textual criticism in basics archaeology, you leave it as it is, you do not change anything. And so that's number one. Number two was Leo Tavares's SO theorem, which limited the number of numerical systems we could use, the only two that were available in the text. That made perfect sense. So that's another part of the methodology. But then the final methodology is that we take the number from what we're looking for is significant passages. And this is probably one of the best parts of the proof of the math of the Bible, is that we're not looking at random passages. We're not interested in random passages. We're interested in significant, theologically significant passages. So from just a basic Bible standard, Genesis 1:1 is significant. It's the first Bible verse read on the moon, for crying out loud. And so it's significant in that own right. And that's part of the pattern. God did that on purpose. He hid it under all of our nose for 3,000 years. Nobody knew that the first verse was the most complicated equation in the history of mankind. And that's part of the interesting pattern. It's like, so what does that mean? That it's like, right now we're discovering this. Only in the last 30 years have we really started to discover these things. It's like, and it tells you a lot about what's going on. And that, as like I like to say, Aslan is on the move, from C.S. Lewis, is Aslan is on the move. He's moving things, he's moving pieces in the world. And part of that is the math, that we're discovering this ultimate proof. And I don't mean like a mathematical proof. When I talk about proof, we're talking about an encyclopedic proof, which is again and again and again. It's just thousands and thousands. And we had to stop discovering them because we had too much and we were just trying to catalog it. So yeah, that's part of my methodology. But the final methodology and the most important part is probability theory, which is how you estimate things with math. And basically, specified complexity, Bill Dembski's, who I've communicated with or emailed with, that that you have to use a form of mathematics to quantify it. And say, like with the intelligent design movement and the creation, the Discovery Institute out here in Seattle, where I'm at, is that they have to translate complex biology and microscopic molecular machines that are inside every one of our cells, and translate that into a quantifiable subject matter that can be judged using logic and science. And that's where Bill Dembski comes in. He is a brilliant philosopher and a mathematician, and that's how we get connected. And he was able to translate the complex biology into a logical system, and also a quantifiable system. And this is where what's so great about biblical mathematics is we don't have to do that translation because it's already in a quantifiable language.
Yeah.
Math is quantifiable. That's what you're trying to get to. And so they have to translate all these weird patterns and 3D motors going on, and we don't have to translate it all. It's already in math, which is fundamentally quantifiable. And so like how we do this, one of the simplest ways is we just do like a multiple of 37. What are the chances that this word would be a multiple of 37, right? So in Genesis 1:1, there's a double pattern, and it's according to the grammatical segmentation in the Hebrew. It's like, in the beginning, God created the heavens. That's the first phrase. And in the Hebrew, there's a second phrase, and the earth. Both of those are multiples of 37. So we can calculate it using pure basic probability theory. What are the chances that those two things would work? And so what you do is you just multiply, 1 times 37 1 over 37 times 1 over 37. And then so now this is where the really important part of the methodology is to say, are you asking the right question? If you're asking an irrelevant question, then the data set is all thrown out. And this is questions are really important in science with hypotheses and things like that. And so you have to ask the right question. So what's the next question? We have a perfectly legitimate question in Genesis 1:1. Is the double pattern of 37 in Genesis 1 legitimate? And yeah, it is. It's fairly improbable. Not astronomically improbable, but fairly improbable. So the next question goes like, okay, from a Christian's point of view, what's the most important name in the Bible? Well, I would say 99% of Christians would say Jesus Christ. So now we can say, okay, so what is the probability that the name Jesus and Christ are also multiples of 37? Really simple math. So what you do, and in probability theory is you just multiply those four categories together. And so what happens is when you do that, which is a fair question, I think from any Christian would say, this is a fair question. We got a double pattern in Genesis 1:1. We got a double pattern in Jesus Christ's name. Any Christian wants to know, like, yeah, that's what I want to know. This is like the fundamental question of Christianity. And so when we multiply all those four factors together, we get basically a 1 in 2 million chance. It's around that. It's a little short of 2 million. So the odds that would happen using basic probability theory is that it's about a 1 in 2 million. Those are astronomical odds. Basically, anything past 1 in 1,000 is a statistical probability, like a statistical impossibility. And so that's how we know and how we legitimize our work is by using basic statistical science and probability theory.
Okay. Okay. So I just want to share my screen a bit.
Yeah.
Hang on. Let me just.
By the way, 1 divided by 37 is 0.027, which is interesting because there's 27 New Testament books, and the word liberty in the King James Bible occurs 27 times.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah.
It's interesting. It's funny to me how it continues to go to the point where
Right.
it's here we go.
Oh, you're getting complicated here.
Yeah. So okay. So here's the formula that you're talking about from Bill Dembski that to calculate, right? So
Right.
I think what I heard you saying is that you have multiple different examples, so that you just multiply those together. That's true, right?
Mm,
But you're calculating the p,
mm.
the probability simpliciter of, what are the odds that, I don't know what the pattern was, but you were saying that we would have 37 and then of God created the heavens, and then the and earth part equals 37 as well. So somehow you got odds of 1 in some fairly improbable number or something like
Mm.
that. So that the total number that when you multiply, you were giving me the p. The p equals 1 divided by 2 million. Is that correct?
Um, uh, maybe I'm not sure exactly where you're going with it. No, I mean, basically, it's like 1 over 37, 1 over times 1 over 37 times 1 over 37, 1 times 1 over 37, and that gives you the total odds, which is about like 1.7 million, 1 in 1.7 million. So
Okay.
it's just basic probability theory. I don't know if Dembski he might have created his own sort of super math about it. But we're just using probability theory, which is a well-established science.
Yeah. Okay. And so that's what this is. So this is my sort of my thing why I'm a little bit skeptical because
Well, you can see it right there in the number in the third pattern where it's like 1 over 6 times 1 over 6 times 1 over 6 equals 1 over 216. So it's like over a 1 in 216th chance. That's this exact same patterns that we're using when I was like 1 over 37 times 1 over 37. So you can
yep.
see it right there.
But so here's the part that I think you're missing and that I've never seen, but you guys as mathematicians, maybe you could do this because in order to get the total probability, you have to get what's called the saturated probability, so that you have to assess how many probabilistic resources do you have?
Right, right,
Right. So there are replicational resources, like so in this case, right? Like what's the probability I would roll a three times in a row? That's 1/6 times 1/6. But if I had more probabilistic resources, which is this n, if I could roll the dice 9 times instead of
right,
just three, the odds go up that I might
right.
get three in a row.
Sure, sure.
The K here in the formula represents specificational resources.
Right,
So these represent for example, a lot of your patterns, you're specifying certain ways of getting it. So like, digital summation. And I think you did try to provide a justification for that in that you're kind of, well, that's the simplest way to do it. But somebody could say, yeah, but you could have divided all those things, or you could have multiplied all the
right, right. Exactly.
so that again, those different specifications would increase the odds that you're going to get a hit. So
Right. It's good. It's very good criticism. Yeah. Probably the best criticism of the subject. Yeah.
awesome, yeah, and that's just why I'm a little bit skeptical. But I wanted to ask you as an expert, do you know anyone who's attempted to account for the saturated probability? Because I think that's what we need to judge. Is this
Right.
just chance?
No, I don't think we've dug that far into the evidence. Um, and part of that is because we're a very young movement. There's not a lot of us. Um, and we're only 30 years old, basically. And so it's like the beginnings of it all. But that's probably the best question you've asked all night. That's a really good one. And it's something that I'm worried about and why we are so assiduously concerned with control text. That's to meet your answer there is we're talking about, we've got to control the K is what we're talking about here. Is because we're like because language is unlimited and math is unlimited. And if you don't control it somehow, then you can come up with anything. And with free association, I can basically say anything I want. I've done it in my videos, one of my most successful videos on YouTube, where I basically showed that I could basically say anything I wanted because you can keep changing the language and with synonyms, different phrasing until you find what it is. And we actually see a little bit of this in the Old Testament in some of the historical resources of Gematria, where they kind of used it as a cheat code to actually put it in there. It's not an example of, say, divine coding. It's an example of, say, the author, Micah or Habakkuk, I think, who were copying each other and trying to replicate the pattern in Gematria. And so, yes, that's the most important criticism of all is like, what are the final resources? But the question is like, how do you catalog that? How do you catalog the whole of English language, or how do you catalog the whole of all the vocabulary of the Old and New Testament? That's why we limit ourselves to very specific categories. So, for instance, like Leo came up with the SO theorem, I came up with the theonomic thesis. The theonomic thesis says that the output of the information is primarily restricted to, primarily, I'm just covering bases, is primarily restricted to the holy names of the Bible. That way, we are categorically restricting ourselves so that we're not choosing like Apple means this, we're not free associating. We're saying we're limiting ourselves to a very strict data set of holy names. And within that data set, there's even a stricter data set. So there's a lot of Old Testament holy names. We generally don't touch with those. Generally, we're just talking about the Tetragrammaton and Elohim. In the New Testament, generally, we're just talking about Jesus, Jesus, and Christos. And so we're trying to focus in on the primary things. And so that's how we're controlling K. To answer your question, is that yeah, it's someday maybe a computer scientist can figure out that saturated K value. But at this point, all we can do is just severely restrict ourselves to a few primary theologically everyone knows important words. And so that we have a very restricted data set. And so in that way, it works because we have restricted the K value. And so we're working with a very restricted data set. And within that data set, we can find myriads of patterns that shouldn't be there, that are highly improbable and are all over the place. And so that's how we deal with the K value.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And so in terms of the specification, yeah, as long as you've got a justification as to why you're specifying this target. So you guys have selected divine names or divine titles, right? And stuff like that. But yeah, so I would say fine. You would have to justify that. I would also say like just make sure that you're including all divine titles. So like for example, you would have to include Son of God or Son of Man. These are other things. Like you would have to make sure you're not excluding any divine titles if that's what you're.
Well, maybe. I mean, but on the other hand, there's certainly now some names that are that can be judged more important. Like from the Hebrews, Jews, ancient Jews, they had a very they had yeah, a long list of Old Testament names, but there were two that were head and shoulders above. That we can read, um, we can talk to the experts, linguistic experts, and say, yeah, these are the two primary, and that's the Tetragrammaton and Elohim. And so they are of a different category of that. So yeah, if you dive into, if you're, what I'm getting, what you're saying is if you dive into all the holy names, then you have to use all the holy names for the K value. Absolutely right. And it's so, but what we try to do to try to prove it is by keeping a very restricted data set. So then, because it's such a complicated subject, we have to have a very restricted data set so that we can have something that is provable. But you're right. If we start going out like that, we do it. Then it's much harder to believe and much harder to prove because you're dealing with a lot of intangibles. And so that's why we do things like the fourfold 37 of Jesus Christ and the double set in Genesis. It's a very restricted data set. It's pretty obvious to any Christian that these are really fundamental, important passages and words in the Bible. And once you prove it then you can start to move out into these other areas where the math becomes a little more complex and a little harder to solve. And also, even if you are got the best math in the world, a lot of people are going to disagree with it unless it's very fundamental and simple. And so that's why we stick to that, because right now we're just a beginning movement. We're trying to get people on board so that they can understand the basics of it. And then we grow the math from there. But you're right about the K, and that's the best criticism I've ever heard. So well done, sir.
That's just me as a layman. So yeah, and you've been
That's
engaged with
great.
a mathematician, so I feel honored. Bill Dembski did me proud today, but
You sure did. Yeah, you did great. That's fantastic.
awesome.
Can I
Okay,
add something?
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead, dude.
Just one thing that I wanted to. Would it also be fair to say, though, when it comes to these probabilities, that if there's, for example, in the King James Bible, there's 790,849 words total.
Right.
When you start to see patterns where, for example, Savior occurs 37 times, crucified 37, by faith 37, you keep getting the same hits, 37 out of this number, 37 out of this number, 37 out of this number. At a certain point, even if you can't mathematically, I mean, outside of, I mean, it's obviously improbable to continue to see the same patterns over and over. So if you were able to dismiss that at a certain point, aren't you able to simply, I mean, really in real life, you could dismiss anything. I mean, I notice sometimes when I see unbelievers talking, they'll talk about things where they'll say, well, you're seeing patterns where there aren't really any patterns. I mean, you can see patterns anywhere. But then they will turn right around and selectively apply their skepticism and not apply it in other situations. For
Sure. Yeah.
example,
Good
like if
point.
they were to, they will see DNA and they'll say, oh, well, humans and chimpanzees are so similar, we must have a common ancestor. That's a pattern that they see, and they say only a crazy person would dismiss this. I mean, look at it. So they're seeing similarities. Chimpanzees kind of look like people, hands and body style, and the genetics. So they're willing to accept that pattern, but they are
Yeah.
not willing to accept this pattern.
Yeah.
And
Selective
I
skepticism, right?
selective skepticism. So my question would be in this, because these phrases, like just these three phrases, Savior, crucified, by faith, each one of these occurs 37 times in the King James Bible. You have one or 37 out of 798.49 three times there. That's quite improbable Do you agree?
Yeah, as far as I can understand her, yeah, that's how we kind of basically judge these things. But once again, we're going back to K, and we'd have to evaluate it on the saturation value. What other options are out there, and math can be really tricky sometimes. Like what the study of pure mathematics has taught us a lot that sometimes what seems obvious is not obvious. Like the whole birthday test. The birthday test is like get about 24 people in the room and the host asks them like, everybody tell their birthday. And you would think, well, and you find out that a number of people out of those 24 will have the exact same birthday. And everyone's like, that's amazing. Would, how is that possible that so many people, like two or three of them have the exact same birthday? And that's just how mathematics works. Sometimes it's difficult to intuitively understand math. And that's why studying math is really kind of interesting because sometimes it's counterintuitive. And so things that look obvious are not always obvious. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm just saying that that's where you have to get into the finer details and the technical math of it because there are illusions especially in any large data set. I can tell you right now that if you did a mathematical analysis of, say, the phone book, something like that, you would find maddening patterns. You would find patterns that would connect to the pi. You would find patterns, but would they be coherent? Would they be organized? Would they start at the first verse? Would they have a logical coherence to it? And that's the difference between a mass data set and say the patterns that we find in the Bible. The patterns we find in the Bible are coherent. They relate to the holy names and they start in the first verse and they always reflect back to the first verse like a fractal. That's what makes the whole pattern so much different than what just basically a large data set would show.
I just want to say something, David, for you to back you up. Look, I wasn't raising this issue of the saturated probability as like, oh, okay, well, they haven't done the calculation for the mathematical probabilistic resources. Well, therefore, there is nothing special about the patterns. No, this is a suggestion saying we need to do that work. It's kind of like, hey, we can advance the research by getting this saturated probability, and maybe it will prove even to me and Bill Dembski, and look, it would be mathematically proven. Again, you would also have to have what he calls the probability bound, right? And I think
Mhm.
John was mentioning that you guys are using, like Bill Dembski, he has the universal probability bound. Anything that is 1 divided by 10 to the power of 150, that's
Woo.
smaller than that, it's impossible to happen statistically.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. For
Yeah.
sure. When you
So
talk about those sort of exponents, absolutely. That's fine-tuning level of improbability. Yeah.
But one,
so yeah, if you guys did somehow get the math with you guys are all mathematicians and somehow you were able to get a saturated probability smaller than that, then I would be a believer. You guys would convert me, and I would be like, yeah, that there is some intelligent design, and
Right.
that be God behind
Well,
it.
yeah, I mean that the problem is that yeah, I mean you could do that. And it would just take, a lot of argumentation and getting into the weeds and the details. And so what convinced me, after my 5 years of skepticism looking at the stuff and just being kind of fascinated by it, but really very skeptical like yourself, I was like, what convinced me was that I dug into the math and I found the same patterns that everybody else was finding. And against odds. And I was like, what is going on here? And then some of my colleagues, they were doing the same thing. And you're very new to it. It's just all your audience is very new to these concepts, and people are kind of confused. Like, are you talking about numerology? And we're not talking about numerology. I hate numerology, not into numerology at all. But when you get into it and you start studying it and you discover it, it's a transformation. You're like, oh, what is going on here? How did I just discover? And it becomes addictive in a sense because it's like God has shown you something that he has shown no other human on the earth. And it's a signature of his inspiration in the scriptures. You're like, and that you can't get over that. You're just like, I want to discover more. And so Yeah, you're getting into the technical weeds, which is great because you're the host and that's what you need to ask. And that's what we need to be asking is about things like the K value for sure. And that's the next step. Right now we're just trying to like get people involved and let's talk about this because there certainly is a pattern. That's what I'm saying. Like you can see it behind me. We've talked about it enough, and I've shown you enough that to say there's certainly is a pattern there. Now, the technical question from a skeptic's point of view is like, is that a pattern a massive illusion, or because of the saturated probability value, it's just like we're just like cherry picking, we just don't know it.
Yeah.
And that's a great question. That's the next stage, I would say. We're not quite there yet because we're just trying to establish the methodology. I can tell you, like looking at it as a mathematician, like it's obvious. And we've had statisticians who've looked at it and like it's obvious. And so that's why we have like a cadre of engineers, computer scientists, mathematicians, and nuclear physicists and people like that who get into it, but we're all really bad at communicating it. So right now we're just trying to get off the ground. But so have we done the final test, the final stochastic test of, is this absolutely? No, we haven't gotten there yet because it is a very difficult and complex subject matter to define. So what we've done is just try to find all the evidence that we have and say, all right, let's put it out there. Let's see if anybody takes a look at it, sort of thing, and then we'll go from there. So that's where we are at this. It's a great question. We're not quite there yet. We don't have the final value. I don't know if the final value would actually prove it to anyone anyway, because, a lot of people just don't believe, a lot of people are massively skeptical of irreducible complexity and the ID argument. And it's like, it's a huge problem with neo-Darwinism. It's a huge problem. It's like, it breaks it down and they're like, oh, I don't think so. It's like, that's not an argument. It's like, so there's a disconnect. And so, yeah, that's a goal that we should definitely be going to. And thank you for bringing that up, because that's probably the best thing as a host you could do is to bring up that question, the hardest question for us to answer. But we're not there yet. That's all I can say.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, like I said, but I think that's the good thing is to get people excited to get involved to let's do our best to take it to that next level. Let's get more mathematicians involved and let's do the work. Let's
Right.
find out. But yeah. Okay. Well, my last question for tonight is going to be a fun one. So we kind of already hinted at it, but so as David had revealed, I am pro-Shroud. I do believe the Shroud of Turin is great evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Now you've got this take, and I don't think actually Pam Moon talked about. So there's the there's an epsilon shaped wound, which
Yeah.
if you reverse it, it's a three, and then that's the Trinity. Or I've heard about seven different interpretations of
Oh,
this,
okay.
but I just want to get from you. So what is the case? What is the case from numerical patterns in the shroud? You mentioned something about threes and sevens. So
Yeah,
yep.
so it's probably best if I describe uh, my journey to discovery because it actually is part of it. And I've gone to some syndiology conferences. Syndiology means the study of the shroud, and there's an army of scholars out there, and they know their stuff. And so it's kind of a scary academic world to enter into. And I've read a lot of Ian Wilson, who's like one of the best authors on the subject, his Australian historian on the subject. And so I knew prior to the math of the Bible, I knew a lot about the shroud, and I was a believer way back when, just because I believe that the shroud, the more you look at it, it's kind of like the math of the Bible. It's like an encyclopedia of proof. You look at it, it's like God left an encyclopedia of proof on this fabric. It's nuts. The things they found in it, 3D imaging, things like that, pollens from Jerusalem. I mean, it just goes on and on. And then the metacarpal damage to the wrist where the thumb goes in, and they didn't even know that existed, and that's where I came up with. Let me just start with this is because I would like to talk about this because nobody really knows about it, and we'll talk about it for the first time here. Is what I call the Secundo Pio paradox. So Secundo Pio, 1898, was the first to photograph the shroud, and he was an Italian photographer. and he just did it at the behest of the Vatican or what have you. And he and back then, of course,
You
go
can
ahead.
share your screen if you need as well.
No, well, I will eventually, yeah. But so Secundo Pia paradox is that he discovered he took the picture, and of course back then it was chemical photography, which means required negative. And so when he put it through the negative positive process, he discovered that the shroud was a negative image because he flipped it and it was like suddenly he saw that it was positive. Now, the criticism and the skepticism of the shroud is based on the idea that it's a medieval forgery and in the 1988 carbon 14 is like which is nonsense and we can I can rock and roll on that stuff all day long. But the idea is that it's a medieval forgery. And the Secundo Pio paradox is okay, why would anyone want to make a fake like this? Like I'm an archaeology major. I knew that were tons of fakes. John Calvin talks about it. You know, there's more splinters of the cross than you could make an entire boat out of. It's like, yeah, I knew they were all fakes. So initially I was a skeptic, but the more you learn about it, the more you know, hey, there is some stuff that is crazy going on in this shroud. Crazy stuff that is like all scientific. Like what is happening here? So I was already convinced, but the Secundo Pio paradox is like basically the more you try to prove that the shroud is a medieval forgery, the more you prove that it's real. And the reason is like because the facts and the evidence on the shroud are so scientific and so incredible that you're saying that the guy who forged it is actually just as great and supernatural as Christ. Because like, how could anyone back then create a photo negative? Like that's where they don't get. The skeptics don't get. It's like, why would anyone make a photo negative? Nobody knows what a photo is. That's like insane. Let alone 3D imaging and stuff like that. It's like nobody would do that. And so the more you think, the more they say it's a fraud, the more they're like, you prove that it's true. Because either it's Jesus and the resurrection, or it's like the most supernatural being ever in history in the medieval ages. Take your pick. Well, it's supernatural irregardless. That's the paradox. So I
Yeah.
thought that was kind of cool, something that maybe needed to be added to the syndology community. Um, and
It
but
reminds me of oh, sorry, I'm
no,
interrupting.
no, you go ahead.
I just want to back you up what you're saying there, because believe it or not, these are I'm going to quote two non-Christians right now who said they made that exact same argument and said, so Barry Schwartz, right? He was the
Right, I know, Barry.
official Sturt photographer, a friend of mine and stuff like that. And he's Jewish, he's not a Christian, and he made that same thing. You want to tell me that a medieval forger made so he didn't believe that it was a miracle, right? He believed there's some
Mm.
kind of natural mechanism, but he did believe that it belonged to Jesus. But he said, but if you tell me some medieval artist made that image, then I'll believe in miracles. And,
That's
and
great. Old Barry Schwartz, huh? Oh,
yeah,
wow.
yeah, that's his famous one of his famous quotes. And we have a non-religious agnostic. So this guy doesn't even believe in God, but he is a medieval PhD medieval art historian.
There you
And he
go.
said the exact same thing you did. Look, no artist in history would be able or could even conceive of making images that are photo negative, three-dimensional, vertically mapped, and all this. He's like, it's totally unprecedented. And
It's
on this,
insane.
he
Yeah.
believes it's authentic to Jesus, and he's an agnostic. So, yeah,
That's well, he should check his faith because he's got the wrong belief. If he
yeah,
thinks it's authentic and he doesn't believe in God, then he's got a screw loose. But yeah, no, yeah, you're on board, and that's why I love this idea of coming on your channel because I saw that you were a big Shroud guy, and I'm a big Shroud guy too because I think it's like there's the Bible, and then right after the Bible there's a Shroud. It's like, and I can dig into this stuff all day long. I love it. And so you're asking about then the fundamental pattern that I discovered. Which is the final chapter of my book, which correlates if the audience has been following this time along, is that I keep coming up with talking about the numbers 3 and 7 and the 3-7 code. And so in my mind, in 2016 on Thanksgiving Day, I had in my mind the 3-7 code, which at that point we were just really discovering to the nth degree all these threes and seven in the Bible. And that's when I came up with the idea of the 3-7 code, and I named it. And so then on 2016, Thanksgiving morning, I wake up and my mind is just awash with math from the Bible because I'm just studying it all the time, and I'm like discovering all these new patterns in the names and in important places in the Bible. And I was like, and I said to myself, laying in bed, mind you, I say to myself, is like, if there are this many threes and sevens in the Bible, then there's got to be a 3 and 7 on the Shroud of Turin. And as soon as I said that to myself, I like I covered my mouth and was like, well, we already know there's a 3. That's what the synonologist community calls it. They calls it the 3-shaped bloodstain. In Ian Wilson's book, the Blood in the Shroud, they call it the 3 shaped bloodstain. And it's like on the face. And I was like, I'm 50% there already. But then I was like, the skeptic in me took over, and he said, like, hold on. All right, these are blood stains, guy. They come in, and there's a lot of them on the Shroud, and the Shroud is a really big thing. And so, if there's that correlating 7, because in the Bible, if you see a 3, you're supposed to see a 7. It's like if there's a correlating 7, well, it can't be like on the back of the ankle. And it can't be vaguely 7. It's got to be, it's got to be somewhere that you can connect the dots so that you're not dealing with that K value that you're talking about. If you're looking all over, I mean, you could probably find a vaguely any sort of number on the Shroud if you're looking all over. And so I was like, yeah, that's good. That's probably good because quite frankly, at that point, I didn't want to think about the possibility that there was a code written in the blood of Jesus Christ, and I was the first one to discover it. That kind of scared me. But at the same time, I was so curious that I got up and I went to my computer and I turned on Photoshop. I'm a master of Photoshop. And I brought up the Shroud from the website. They got really in-depth pictures that you can get of the Shroud. And I brought it up and I was looking at it and I'm like, well, obviously I can see the 3. The 3's there. And I'm looking around. I don't see any 7s. There's no 7s. It's like, whew. I was like, for a second there, I thought I discovered like, a code written in the blood of the Son of God. I was like, that would be scary as all crap. And then I was like about to turn off the computer and I was looking at it. I was like, there's like 2 prominent blood stains on the portraiture on the face shot of Christ. I'm like, one is clearly a 3. I can see that. I was like, the other one's like weird. I was like, what? And I'm looking at it and I didn't, I was like, so I was like, okay, let's just horizontally flip it. And which it goes back, by the way, this methodology goes back to 3773, mirroring, mathematical mirroring. And of course, the Shroud is a photographic mirror, positive to negative. And so I was like, oh, let's just flip it horizontally. And as soon as I flipped it horizontally, the 3 disappeared because it was backwards, and the 7 appeared immediately. And they're right there. One here and one here, right on either side of the face of Christ. And I was like, oh, hold on. That looks like a pattern. But then the secondly, I was like, how are you ever going to prove that? It's like, you can't prove it by blood, by shapes of blood. That's impossible. The only way you can prove it is by proving the math first. And then if you prove the math first and people believe the math, and they believe the Shroud, boom. They're like, it's obvious. And here's the killer part is that once you see, and I'll bring it up here, once you see the picture, you can't unsee it. And that's the crazy part. Let me see here.
Your star.
Yeah, there's my star. Ba, 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 ba.
Yeah, I was just looking it up. I know what you're talking about with the 7. It's like on the side of the opposite side of the head.
Right. So I've got a picture of it here, and I'll show you. This is the one that I first put out.
We're just seeing the top 3-7 Bible connection. So if you're on something else,
Oh, you're not getting this.
when you shared your screen, maybe you just shared your internet or
I
like
guess that's what's going on. Yeah. Um,
if you share your entire screen, we'll see everything
Oh,
you.
share your sharing is paused. Stop sharing.
Oh, okay.
Why
By
is
the
it?
way,
Oh,
Dale,
Yeah,
remember how we said earlier that the word forgiven occurs in the King James Bible 42 times? 3 divided by 7 is 0.42. So if you've got that on the shroud, it's interesting that you've got a 3 and a 7. 3 divided by 7 is 0.42, forgiven.
interesting. Okay, okay. And well, one thing John was saying, well, while he's trying to find his book, David, he mentioned that this pattern on the shroud itself. Okay, he's got it up, but
Hmm.
just so I know, John, so you're saying this isn't evident, independent evidence in itself. It's kind of independent supporting evidence of if you buy the numerical patterns, then like this will have immense value. It's not like this.
exactly, exactly.
Okay, so it
Yeah,
supports you
so
can
this is the
see it.
original photograph or JPEG that I made in 2016. And I was like trying to point out like uh, three, and look, if you look at it closely, they're both Times New Roman. You know, the font of fonts that all newspapers use. It's like that's a Times New Roman 7 that way. They're reversed images, so you can only see it's a mirroring that's going on. And so yeah, it's not for a skeptic, it's probably too much. It's too much to believe. But if for somebody who understands the math of the Bible, it's obvious. It becomes
Yeah.
obvious. And once you look at it, you can't not see it. You will always see it. So I've just cursed you both because every time you look at the shroud, you're going to see a 3 and a 7. And you're like, there's that John Elias 3 and 7. That keeps coming back. It's just, a trick of the mind. It's a psychology thing. But once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And everybody's watching this. Sorry, guys, you're always going to see the 3 and the 7 now from now on. And the contention though is like, so yeah, it maybe is a little bit hard to believe and what have you, but um, at the same time, it's such a huge idea and it's such an important idea. If there is a code written in the blood of our Lord on the Shroud of Turin, the most incredible artifact in Christian history, is that not important? And so the question, yeah, is this still in contention? It's not absolute, but I mean, come on, this is a really important question. We're talking about the blood of Christ. What is the blood of Christ? That's the source of Christian salvation. And we're seeing a code that correlates to all the math of the Bible. I mean, it doesn't get much more important than that. So it's like, yeah, let's dig into this stuff. Yeah, we don't have the final answer yet. Um, we can't determine if a blood stain actually is a number or not, but it's an important question that needs to be talked about.
Well, I'm just curious, David, what's your take? Because you are someone that has bought into the numerical patterns. So like what's your take on the 3 and the 7 being on the shroud purposefully as kind of a God wink that yeah, he uses number patterns.
There you go.
It does. It doesn't surprise me at all. I'm thankful that that I don't have any reservations. Like when he shows it, and I just say, oh yeah, I mean that it makes sense. It makes sense to me in the sense that the other day, as a matter of fact, the word shroud itself, if you turn it into the alphabet, S is 19, so S times H times R times O times on down the line, you're going to get the number 3447. So you got 37 right there. 3447 360. That's the square root of shroud. The word blood in the King James Bible occurs 447, and all forms of the word faith is 360. So right there in the word shroud in English, you've got 447 blood and all forms of the word faith 360. It makes sense to me. And this, well, I should say I understand it. I believe it. So it's one of those things where I guess you really can't prove it because you just can't prove it, but I can see it. I can
All
understand
right.
it.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. You intuitive after you study this stuff enough, it's intuitive and you can see the patterns. If you're totally new to it at all, everything seems new. So you don't know how to do it. You have to kind of get into it before you can really experience the intuitive understanding that once you see it, you're like, recognize the pattern immediately. But if you've never heard of the 3-7 code and you don't, you're new to this kind of Bible math, everything seems new and everything is foreign and you're doubting everything. You have to like read about it, which is why you need to buy my book available on Amazon, Proof of God by John Elias. the final encyclopedia of all biblical mathematics, and the all the proof you'll ever need is right in there. It's a huge book. It's really cheap, um, as cheap as I could make it. And so go out there and leave a review if you want to buy some. But if you're curious about this subject, all you audience members out there, go out and buy one of these books, and it will tell you everything you need to know. It's been distilled and it's been concretely placed out there, and you'll get the whole story. If you're at all curious, and you should be if you're a Christian, because what we're talking about here is patterns that are left by God. That it's like almost a third testament. It's a mathematical testament in the Bible. And as a Christian, you should be fascinated by what God has been secretly saying for thousands of years. So go out there and pick this book up and find it, read it, and share it, because you're going to find in a 500-page book full of facts, mathematical and scientific facts that will blow your mind apart. And if you're not interested in that, well, maybe you're not interested in Jesus. Maybe you're not interested in God. That's what this stuff is. It's an absolute revelation, and we're just trying to get it off the ground. That's all.
Awesome. All right. Well said. Yeah. Well, I think that covers everything. David, did you have any last minute questions for John, or have you covered everything on your end as well? Or oh, yeah, I think okay, maybe he stepped away.
Maybe he stepped out. Yeah, he might have stepped out.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah, I stepped out quickly to grab my supper, so I had a meal. But
I think
yeah,
he's back now. Yeah, here he is. David, are
okay.
you there? No?
Okay, fair enough. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Well,
Um,
thank you. Thank you for having me. I
Hey,
love your
was I on
channel.
mute?
It's great. Yeah, you were on mute. Now you're back.
Oh,
Yes.
I'm sorry about that. I was talking and no, it's
Oh,
just it
okay.
was in. I'm sorry. No, I had myself on mute and didn't realize it. So mute on the headset that I'm wearing, not on the screen.
I see.
Yeah, no, it was interesting to watch you two. It's interesting to see uh the two of you together knowing the same types of people and discussing like the William Dembski. That was interesting to see. So I'm satisfied. I have no other questions.
Well, that's
awesome.
great. Well, and Dale, I tell you what, if you want me back on your channel, invite me anytime. I'd love to come back on your channel. We had a wonderful conversation. If you want to bring me on a shroud conversation, I'm familiar with the whole subject and all the major guys out there, and I'd love to talk to them. And hopefully someday I'd like to do a paper for the Syndonology conference. And so I'm almost as expert in the shroud as I am in math. So
Well,
I'd be happy to come back on your channel anytime.
yeah. Well, believe it or not, I've got a show coming up on February 21st where it's on the science. So we're covering four miscellaneous image forming theories. So the first is going to be bacteria. Garza Valdez, can bacteria explain the images? The other is kind of Volcranger patterns. There's I forget what the third one is, but the other one is rainbow bodies. It can the shroud, a guy named Thomas Devon says that no, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. It was a supernatural rainbow body, and that's what created the shroud images. But yeah, if you're welcome for that, or we can do a different show. What you
Sure,
tell me.
yeah. You'll have to send me some information first, because that's not enough to go on, and I have no idea what a rainbow body is. But if you send me some information, then I'll be able to like look at it, and and then maybe I'll say like, yeah, I'll go and talk on there, because I can talk about it from a scientific mathematical perspective too. I'm not just going to be talking about the three and sevens, because there's a lot of science, and I'm a big science guy, and I've done science and things like that. So yeah, I would love to come and talk about it.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, and I'll get your interests too and stuff off. But in addition to the shroud, I was thinking I'd love to have you. I mean, you're an archaeologist. I would love to have you on. I've had David Falk on as an Egyptologist and
Mhm.
stuff like that. So I'd love to get your take on biblical archaeology, as well as shroud. So yeah, you're
Sure,
welcome.
yeah. I'm not technically in archaeology. I studied archaeology in college, but I'm not like a PhD in archaeology or anything like that. But I've been on digs, and I've followed archaeology all my life. So yeah, I have a semi-informed opinion on archaeology, better than the average bear, So yeah, I would love to talk about it. Yeah, so I understand history. So yeah, I have a semi-informed opinion. I don't want to overboast myself. So
Fair enough. Very awesome. Perfect. All right, cool. Well, yeah, this was thoroughly enjoyable. And I do think you've lent a little bit more credibility to this argument in my eyes, kind of thing, from what you've presented here and stuff. There's definitely higher levels that I just had no idea about. So yeah, it's more the case for this is more complicated. There's more to it than I knew about and stuff. And I think it's worthy of looking into and stuff like that. So I thank
Well,
you
that's
for.
all I'm here for. And you know what? As a host, you did your job almost too well. I kind of wish you didn't because because you really asked the right questions. Did you bring out William Dembski's equation and all that? It's like that was great. You did your job well,
Yeah.
and I kind of hate you for it. But just kidding.
They call me the George Costanza of hosts. I get out that
That's
one big
hilarious.
question, and then yeah.
Yeah,
But yeah,
you did great. This was a lot of fun, and I'd do it anytime again. So yeah, let's rock and roll.
awesome. All right, guys. Well, that's it for today. But just for the audience, so I on Sunday at 7 o'clock, I'm going to be live on Carlos Xavier's channel. He's a biblical Unitarian, so he's basically bringing me on to do a Trinitarian podcast. So people are going to be coming and asking me questions about the Trinity and how that makes sense, stuff like that. Maybe I'll mention the three on the shroud and some of the patterns representing the Trinity. Who knows? But yeah, tune in for that. And otherwise, have a great day. All
Okay.
right.
Yes.